Want me to join your Girl Scouts? For me, it was like, I don't like taking part. Like, I was hard, but like, I'm
Let's get started. To show you 8 o'clock. Okay, so last week, one of the things that we talked about, it just so happens I got an email a couple of days after class, specifically with a whole portfolio of 30 locations of CVS's. Okay, so it was just, you remember the whole discussion we had last week about, Walgreens, CVS, buying their sites, developing their sites, and then ultimately selling them off in a portfolio. Remember that whole discussion? Okay, well, this is precisely that. This is a solicitation, obviously, for several of these that were built in 2017. Looks like pretty much a lot of southern, actually pretty much all over the country. But the interesting thing, if you sort of just take a look, they don't actually list a price. They just simply say market prices. Obviously, that's going to vary by location. Okay, they're all built in 2017. But one of the key features that we, had talked about, I think, also was this whole idea of the type of lease being an absolute net lease or triple net lease, that where, once again, the tenant, which would be CVS, would in essence be taking care of any and all responsibilities regarding property maintenance, repairs, operations, whatever it might be. But also take note of the lease term. 2043 would be the expiration. So we'll do the simple math. 2043 minus, let's say 2018, 25-year lease. Okay? So, once again, that's kind of an interesting thing to just sort of take note of, that once again, this sort of stuff is still happening. Many years after they sort of started this concept, back in the probably the mid-90s. But once again, just kind of some of the basics. Once again, absolute triple net, brand new 25-year leases, new construction, offered as a portfolio or individually, so forth, so on. Okay? Questions?
And when did you get this?
Like a couple days after class.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, buy a CVS.
So once again, not just spouting a bunch of random nonsense. Hopefully. Okay. All right. Any questions, thoughts, comments, observations? All right.
I have one.
Yep.
Just kind of thinking from the corporate, if these were corporate stores, them building and selling them off would kind of help their ROA, because they have less kind of fat to make money off. These aren't necessarily money producing assets, but it just kind of, so that was kind of my thinking about why they would sell them off.
Yeah, the whole idea is that the real estate value underneath the store can fluctuate from one year to the next. And so if they can lock in a 25-year lease pretty much with a very, stair-step probably, increases over time, so it's all very predictable, as opposed to being at the whims of what the market may be over that 25-year period, that's great for them. So they're not having to really worry about the underlying volatility of the real estate. They just know that, they're running a business. They're not running a real estate business. They're running, a business of obviously, selling drugs and other, pharmaceuticals and other products. But just that whole idea of really saying we're not in the business of owning and operating real estate. We're in the business of obviously selling retail goods and services. This is actually one of the problems that a lot of retailers got into, early on, from the 1950s up through the 1980s, of where they would build a store, own the store, and then have all that real estate sitting in their portfolio. And then at some point, whenever the business would start to maybe do poorly, they would be a very attractive target for basically a corporate raider to sort of come in, kill the business, but then the real estate was worth more than the business was. Does that make sense? Okay. And actually, one of the properties that I bought probably 15 years or so ago was an operating hardware store. And this hardware store had been in business since 1890 and had been in continuous operation since 1890. But the problem was the hardware store itself wasn't really making any substantive money, but the real estate that the hardware store occupied, which they actually owned the real estate, was worth more than the hardware store itself. So I bought it really as a real estate play of, initially buying the business and then realizing, of course, up front real quickly that the business wasn't going to make any money. Held on to it for a couple of years and then ultimately been able to reposition the real estate and turn a much nicer profit off of that than off of the store itself.
You got rid of the store that was there for 100 years.
Yeah.
You kind of brushed over that, and I kicked out the 100-year tenants. I'm just saying
Well,
what I
technically I bought the business as well as the real estate.
You're okay.
Yeah, so I was a corporate raider. Yeah.
That's awesome. That was a cool story.
Yeah. Okay, moving on.
Can I ask a question about that? The 1031 exchange can be delivered in zero cash flow structure. Can you explain that just a little bit to me?
Okay, so a 1031 exchange.
I know what that is.
Okay.
No, zero cash flow structure, but pay down here and down here.
No money is exchanged.
So then how do they exchange the value?
Because you have previous real estate.
Well, I mean, normally, a 1031 exchange is where you're, in essence, you've got a property that you're selling, that you're moving into this so that you can do basically a like-kind exchange or tax-deferred exchange. And so my assumption is with this, that it would just simply be a way of where you're not having to necessarily come up with any cash, that you would just simply transfer the ownership. Okay, other questions? Moving on.
That's one. That's my notes.
All right. So, this actually fits in quite well with our topic for today, which happens to be, at least the first part of it, leasing. Okay, so let's just sort of start out. Okay, now we've talked a little bit about this before, but we're going to kind of reinforce, and we're going to obviously start now to use some numbers and deal with some of the specific issues as it relates to this. Okay, so just to make sure everyone is clear, we have sort of gross leases on one side of the sort of extreme, and then kind of like the Walgreens example here, we have absolute triple net leases kind of on the other side, okay? So gross leases, from the tenant's perspective, is all bills paid. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so that all electricity, all property taxes, insurance, maintenance, anything is all included in kind of a flat rate that you're going to get from the property owner as to the lease. Okay, so the opposite of that, obviously, from the absolute triple net is, from the tenant's perspective, tenant pays everything. So all operating expenses, etc. Okay? Does that make sense in terms of the two polar extremes? Yes? Okay. Now, most leases fall somewhere, not necessarily in the middle of that continuum, but probably close to one side or the other, okay? And a lot of these things can be very easily negotiated up front, depending on the power of the prospective tenant, okay? But if you've got a Class A, high, net worth, high quality sort of tenant, they can drive to a large extent what the actual lease terms might be and what they're going to be ultimately responsible for. And they try, in many cases, to probably standardize that lease throughout all their locations everywhere. Now, usually there are going to be regional differences as to kind of you know, what may be included in one market is not necessarily included in another market for one reason or another. Because, I mean, it's a simple, let's just take electricity, for example. There are certain parts of the country where electricity is really, really cheap. Why? Anybody have an idea?
Supply and demand.
No?
Hydropower?
Yeah, because those parts of the country that are serviced by basically hydropower, you know, obviously the big dams that, you know, obviously, the big turbines, that sort of thing, doesn't really cost a whole lot to generate electricity on a per kilowatt hour versus coal-fired plants or, you know, nuclear plants or whatever other, you know, types of electricity generation, you know, may be taking place. You're going to have very substantive regional differences. Plus, not only the cost of electricity may be different from one part of the country to another, the actual use of electricity, the amount of usage of electricity is going to vary from one part of the country. You think about a place like Texas or Florida where you've got extremely warm weather, we're going to be heavy users in the, especially, well, in Florida all year round in the sense of, you know, air conditioning. I mean, take for example this building. I mean, whether any of you actually realize this or not, this building does not have heat. Does that blow you away just a little bit? So you have a building that was built literally about 10 years ago, and they purposely did not put any heat in the building because they were like, why would we need heat? You know, it never gets really cold enough in South Florida to really ever turn on the heater. You know, but now there are probably a couple of days in January, February where you're like, wow, it's really cold. But, you know, but it's just kind of an interesting, you know, phenomenon. But you take that, you know, transplant, I mean, can you imagine that up in the Northeast, you know, really not having heat? Of course not. But then again, you can also sort of understand why some buildings up there don't have air conditioning. You know, so you have those regional differences that will impact, in some cases, lease structure and who's responsible for what and what those costs may be. Question?
So that changes, that's a rule that changes for commercial, not having to have a heat source inside the building?
That is a really good question. But
It's fascinating how you don't have to have an air conditioner. You're like, if a landlord's, you know, the AC breaks, they're not required to fix it as long as the heater's working. And you're thinking in Florida like that doesn't make sense. But,
right.
You know, that's.
And that's probably because, once again, it's an international building code as opposed to maybe a regional variation.
Something to think about.
Yeah. Anyway, it's kind of an odd little work. But anyway, okay. So the point being is, just realize there are going to be regional differences. In many cases, you're going to have tenants that could have some, you know, obviously far-reaching kind of tentacles in terms of all the different sort of locations that they're in and how that may impact the kind of leases that they want. Just out of curiosity, I mean, I know obviously a fair number of you have dealt with commercial leases before, but anything just particularly interesting or strange that a tenant has ever wanted or desired as it relates to a commercial lease? Anybody? Angela, I know you've got to have something.
I know we have some.
It depends. I do commercial leases all the time, and I've heard it all probably.
I mean, anything that just sort of stands out as kind of weird or strange?
Some of the TIs
Okay.
that we get is, they're a little bit bold for, you know, somebody that's only got one business and is not a national tenant.
Okay, oh, fair enough. Okay, so TIs, tenant improvements, okay, which is basically a tenant coming into you and saying, okay, you've got this blank space that you know, want to lease up, and they want to start whatever kind of business it is, whether it's a restaurant, you know, in many cases that's going to be one of the higher, you know, sort of cost of tenant improvements if you're going to, you know, potentially pay for it. But the idea is they're coming in to you as the property owner and saying, we want you to pay for a good portion, if not all, of our tenant improvements on this space. And, you know, and in some cases you would just laugh at them and say, you know, you're crazy if you think that I'm going to, you know, come in and I'm going to basically fit out an entire commercial kitchen for you. And,
Especially if they're a startup.
yeah, and, you know, so, because they're obviously trying to defer or defray those costs for themselves and push them onto you as the property owner. And so, you know, that is definitely something that you know, you see all the time.
Or usually if we are going to represent them and we think that's a bad idea, we'll try to, you know, put the value in amortizing it over a longer
Yes.
lease.
Yeah, if you can get a long-term commitment, and once again, they're a high-quality tenant, then you're gonna be much more open to that idea of spending some of that money. But if you're wanting to do like a 3-year lease, or, you know, even maybe a 5-year lease, then you've gotta, you know, say, that's insane. Okay, all right, any other weird examples of things that people potentially ask for?
They can ask for an exit clause. I had a tenant that just had that. I did a lease for Cora Health, and they wanted a 10-year lease, but they wanted that within the first 3 years, they'd have the right to cancel their lease.
Wow.
Which was interesting to do, but they're guaranteeing whatever build out we pay out and whatever commissions. That's the only way I structured the deal.
Yeah.
So we would do it, but that's the only way we'll do it.
Interesting. Then you're still stuck with a property that is kind of a medical
Right.
use that could limit, you know.
Right, but when we assess the
Right.
demographics of it too, they're gonna do fine.
Yeah.
They're just moving from one location to another, and our location is better, so the risk kind of outweighed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's another, I mean, it's a great, another example of kind of a high finish out tenant are, you know, sort of medical tenants that, you know, are gonna have very specialized space and
Right.
needs, and it's not really gonna be all that useful to a non-medical tenant, so.
Especially dentists.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
the worst.
really, yeah, really strange, you know, plumbing and, you know.
Very expensive to put
Yeah.
in.
Okay,
I was talking to the pizza owner over here, and they kind of moved into the computer store next door, and they said for the TI, the owner of the building gave them 6 months rent instead of TI capital. Is that typical? I've never.
that's also, yeah, if you, especially if you've got a really slow market, that, you know, there's just not a huge demand for the space, and it's been sitting there obviously for months, and the property owner says, okay, what's another, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 months of
Instead
not
of
getting
putting
rent?
money right up
Yeah,
front.
and that way that the you know, the tenant can go ahead and maybe kind of pre-finance those things. But then usually under that condition, then the owner of the property is also gonna get to lay claim to those assets, you know, if they, you know, move out at some future date. And that begins to be a really sticky issue as well, as, you know, it needs to be very clear up front as to who gets to keep whatever tenant improvements are put into place, because especially if it's a mixed bill of, you get the property owner paying for part of it, you get the tenant paying for part of it, then, you know, at the conclusion of their lease, that once again, maybe 5, 10, 15 years or more down the road, you know, you as a property owner, you could have two perspectives. You could have the perspective of, yeah, I want all that stuff because I can just move another restaurant tenant immediately into that space, and they can take advantage of that pizza oven or, you know, whatever else it is, the Vent-A-Hood or, you know, other, you know, features of the property without, you know, a whole lot of extra fit out. But then you also could have a situation of where, once again, like on a medical office, then all of a sudden, you know, you've got something that has been plumbed out for a dentist or whatever it is, which really limits the use to a, you know, another dentist. And you're saying 15 years from now, please remove all that stuff, you know, so that, you know, I don't have to go in and do the demo work to actually, you know, retrofit the space to make it something useful. So those are just things to begin to think about. Okay, moving on. So let's just say that we take a look at a gross lease here, and give me a sort of a base amount for this gross lease. Normally, this is also another thing to sort of point out. For commercial spaces, we pretty much quote the rent as per square foot per year, okay? Whereas residential leases, it's almost always quoted on a per square foot per month, okay? And so it's an important distinction, and you know, your first few sort of kind of looking at, you know, packages of properties, and you're sort of saying, wow, why is there such a huge difference? Well, in many cases, it's because of how it's being quoted. But once again, for most commercial properties, it's going to be on a per square foot per year basis. So give me a dollar amount here.
20.
Okay. So $20 per square foot per year, and that's going to be our gross lease, let's say. And now with that, we probably want to have some step-ups, okay? Now, a step-up, normally, you know, it could be a percentage amount, could be a dollar amount, could be like once a year, could be every couple of years, you know, but normally it's kind of a predetermined amount that you're going to build into that lease so that everyone knows that that lease rate is going to escalate by, you know, that certain dollar amount or certain percentage each year. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, so what we might say, just to keep things simple, a step up of $1 per square foot per year for the term of the lease. We say maybe it's a 10-year term. Just to keep the math relatively simple. Okay, now let's also say that we want some expense stops in there. What are expense stops?
It's a way of limiting your exposure as the landlord.
Okay, let's do precisely what he said. It's a way of limiting your exposure as the landlord for typically operating expenses. Okay, so what you would say is that maybe for the property, you as the landlord are going to cover the first, let's say, $5 per square foot per year of operating expenses after the $5 tenant is responsible. Okay, does that make sense? So in other words, so the terminology expense stoppage just basically means I, as the property owner, am going to stop paying expenses above $5 per square foot per year. Okay, so if the tenant comes in and they only use maybe $3 per square foot per year, they don't get a rebate. Okay, it's just saying that up to that $5 per square foot, I'm covering it, okay, as the property owner. Now, if they use $7 a square foot, the tenant uses $7 a square foot, then, in essence, the tenant is going to be billed for that extra $2 a square foot per year. Does that make sense? Okay, so now, ideally, what the landlord is trying to do with that is, you said, very accurately, which is to limit their exposure, okay? And so, they're just sort of saying, here, it's not necessarily a situation of where they're trying to take advantage of the tenant or, pull anything, strange or funny or weird. They're just simply saying, okay, this should be the normal sort of set of operating expenses. I mean, at least a good, straightforward property owner would be saying, okay, here's what the average cost of utilities has been over the past several years. So in order for me not to necessarily have to bill you every single month for these utilities and deal with collecting that amount and so forth, I'm just going to bill this into your rent, and anything above and beyond that, then yeah, I'm going to bill you for. Okay? Does that make sense? Yep.
By doing so, is the owner trying to predetermine his profit margin or what?
Yeah. That's exactly what they're doing. Because, as I said, they're not going to give you a rebate if you use less than what that number is. In other words, like I said, if you used no utilities whatsoever, because you weren't really occupying the space, that, let's say it's an industrial space, as an example, just a warehouse, and the only utilities you ever used were whenever you came in, almost like a self-storage building. You raised the door, you turn on the light, and in essence, did whatever you needed to do, you would probably have no utility consumption almost whatsoever. Well, then the property owner would get to keep that $5. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So any questions on this piece? Does that make sense? Yep.
What does the $1 represent then?
Okay. So the $1, as I said, it's a separate item. It's just part of the step-up clause, meaning that you're just simply determining what the rent increase will be annual.
Yeah, okay.
So let's just say in the second year, so basically in year one, it's going to be $20 a square foot. Year two, 21, year 3, 22, and so forth, so on. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, but if we were to try to ask the question of, well, what is the owner's sort of net from all of this, okay? Like, in other words, to convert sort of the gross into a net amount that they're actually receiving, then you'd have to take another step, which would then be to basically subtract out the $5, okay, each year, including the first year. So for that first year, their net, whoops, $15 per square foot. The next year, in this case, would be $16. The net would be $17, and so forth, so on. Does that make sense?
It doesn't, like, that's the minimum you're gonna make because.
Right.
Right, because utilities might not always be maxed out.
Correct. Correct. Yep.
I haven't seen it before, but I've been curious. Do you know when a landlord's putting an expense stop in, if they will include property taxes into the OPEX?
In many instances, yes, because under most normal arrangements, property taxes are going to be considered an operating expense. It's just a question of whether or not they choose to include it, because, as I said, that all gets to the point of oh, there it is. It depends, once again, where you're going to fall, sort of on that continuum as to what you're going to include and what you're not going to include in terms of, if all of a sudden you say, as the property owner, I'm going to shift the property taxes, I'm going to shift the insurance, I'm going to shift the utilities, I'm going to shift all repairs and maintenance. The more you're shifting, well, the further and further and further you're going in this direction toward basically, an absolute triple net lease. Okay, does that make sense? But there's no absolute, in the sense of what you can choose to shift and what you can't. It really is going to be determined as a negotiation between the landlord and the tenant.
Well, the reason I ask is sort of just down here, I want to be focused on looking at the tax rates here. Property tax is definitely a thing here.
Yeah.
And it would be extremely beneficial for a landlord to write that in.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because, once again, and this is where the regional differences come into play, because there are other states in the country where their property taxes are virtually non-existent.
Yeah.
But, states like Florida and Texas, have very heavy property tax burdens, then, it really does matter, kind of who ends up having to pay those bills, but also dealing with the increases that may be forthcoming, as a result of, value changes.
Collectively, the rent houses we have back home, it's like, we pay $300 a year. 2-3 houses.
Right. Okay.
It's insane.
All right. So any questions about this? Feel pretty comfortable? Yep. Jay.
The expense stop, can that be over the life of the lease, or can you limit that, like the first 10 years?
You can pretty much do anything you want to do. Okay. It's just a question of you agreeing with your tenant as to how you want to set it up. I mean, normally it's just going to be over the lease term, whatever that lease term is. Whether it's a 5-year lease, 10-year lease, 20-year lease, and just simply saying, well, we're putting it at this. But you're absolutely right that if you had, let's say, a 25-year lease, trying to predict out what those expenses, those normal expenses might be 25 years from now, would be virtually impossible. And you could really get yourself, in a world of hurt as the property owner, limiting your sort of exposure, to what that expense stop could be. I mean, you could just simply say that, based upon increases in property taxes or other operating expenses, we will change that maybe based on consumer price index or some other sort of third party, mechanism to try to reflect, those changes. Okay.
So that's in addition to their commission rate?
Yeah. So yes, simple answer. We're actually going to get to that. Okay. Other question? Okay. Okay. All right, so let's just sort of move forward. Okay, so the next one I want to talk a little bit about would be net leases. And consumer price index adjustments. All right, so here, we're kind of, maybe looking at it, instead of a gross lease, let's say we're taking a look at it just as a net lease. And so give me a dollar amount per square foot. Okay, so $25 per square foot per year for our net lease, all right? Now, what we can do here is instead of building in specific sort of step-ups, of a dollar amount or a precise percentage, here we would simply say, your rent is going to be, obviously, is going to have a base of $25 per square foot. It's never going to be lower than that, okay? We're not going to let it go lower, even if you have a negative CPI, but you're probably not ever going to have that. But for the most part, it's going to adjust upward based upon whatever the annual consumer price index numbers are from one year to the next. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's just say, once again, this would be like year one. So you've got year two, let's say in year three, those kind of, and that the consumer price index basically goes up, in this case, maybe by 2% for that year, and goes up, I don't know, 4%, and then, some high inflation. And then maybe goes back down to 1%. Okay, just to kind of do the calculations. All right, so all you're going to be doing is basically starting off with whatever the current rate is of the $25, and you're going to multiply it for this year times itself, which would be 1 plus the 2%, and that's going to give you the dollar amount in rent for that year. Does that make sense? Okay, for the following year, you're going to take whatever that ending amount was and multiply it by itself plus the 4%. We get the new rate. And then for year 4, take whatever that amount was, multiply it by 1 plus 1%. Okay? All right, so let's just see what we get for each of those. Okay, so 25.50. And that goes down here for this year. Times 1.04. 26.52 times 1.01. 26.79. Here, so you'll be confused. All right, so the actual lease amount for each of those respective years are the ones highlighted in yellow. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, let's just go ahead and, for fun, we'll go ahead and do a full 5 years. All right. Okay, what do we want the percentage to be for that year?
3.
3. I have a feeling we're going to pick 3. Okay. All right, so we put in the 26.79 times 1.03, 27.59. Okay. Now, if you're off just a teensy bit because of the pennies on the rounding, once again, we're not going to concern ourselves over that. Okay. But just try to be normal with your rounding or consistent with your rounding, and you should be fine. Okay. All right. So now let's do this. Those are our lease rates for each of the 5 years, and they have been adjusted for the consumer price index. But now what we want to do is we want to get an average net rent. Okay? And this is probably gonna be, go ahead.
I just have a question. So why, it's like a very small increase by the percent. I know it's going up and down, but what is the advantage? Like, what's that, does that add up over time? Like, who's that gonna?
And it's not only does it add up over time, but think about it, that this is per square foot per year.
Okay.
So just
You got 5,000.
let's just say that you've got a, you know, a relatively small retail space of like 10,000 square feet, okay, or, you know, so a retail store. All right, so you've got 10,000 square feet. Their initial rent would be $250,000 a year, okay? Well, by the end of that 5 years, instead of being $250,000 a year, it'd be $275,900. So, you know, I mean, it's not a huge difference, but, you know, I'd like an extra 25 grand in my back pocket as the property owner, you know, on a 10,000 square foot space.
That should protect it from inflation.
Right. That's really pretty much the whole idea behind it, is that, you know, it's just a way to ensure that you as the property owner are not being left out in the cold with respect to, you know, changes in market conditions, okay, while the lease is ongoing, okay? Because there could be much wider, you know, swings, you know, beyond what the consumer price index is potentially taking into account. Now, you could have, you know, once again, the whole area is being redeveloped, or you know, that's being opened up by virtue of you know, brand new. Well, take for example, I mean, obviously the big news this past week was what about Amazon selecting. You know, you've got obviously Long Island, New York, and obviously they're, you know, close to DC, and then another location in Tennessee. You know, so you've got 3 locations in the country. They're going to see a pretty substantial, you know, increase in employment, you know, in a very quick sort of turnaround of those folks moving into that area, needing housing, you know, needing, you know, other goods and services themselves. So, you know, you could, you know, overnight see a property that you've been leasing out for the past several years, all of a sudden, you know, escalate dramatically in actual value because the consumers would actually be going to it, but yet you're locked in as the property owner, you know, to just maybe a consumer price index, which doesn't really reflect overall local market conditions that well.
The opposite can happen too.
Sure.
The market can go the other way, but then you also are pretty like, it's likely that they will default on the lease if they're.
Well, if it's so bad that they're not getting any customers and eventually they're going to have to shut down, then yeah, there's a good chance they're going to default. But if they have a parent company, you know, then you potentially have the opportunity to obviously sue them and get satisfaction, because they're the ones theoretically that are back to the lease. Right. Angela?
Would, rather, have you ever seen it structured to where they do either or, whichever is greater?
You literally can do anything you want, okay? How many of you, just out of curiosity, have taken the Argus class with, okay, so I know a couple of you. One of the things that you get into, or should get into, with the Argus class is specifically being able to model sort of lease by lease sort of cash flow analyses, and so that you can have 100 tenants within a property, and every single one of those tenants has a different lease in terms of the dollar amount, in terms of the escalations, in terms of the termination, in terms of whether it has maybe percentage rent attached to it, or whatever. I mean, do you guys want to say anything about that?
It's unlimited, but you know, you got to keep it. You know, as a property owner, you want to keep it reined in because it would be hard to manage. But yeah. Argus is amazing. It's just like you could spend a lifetime just learning that program.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea behind a program like Argus versus Excel is that Argus is targeted exclusively for these really weird variations in leases. And you want a standardized package and program that can take that information and translate that legalese of, okay, you've got escalations of this amount, you've got percentage rents, and build that into a, you know, a financial model so that if you've got 100 tenants or 500 tenants or 5,000 tenants, you can then roll that up into a singular operating statement to really get your head around what's actually happening. you know, and where your exposures are, and that sort of thing. So, you know, initially, you know, whenever, you know, people start to use Argus, they get kind of overwhelmed and like, oh my God, you have, you know, I mean, it's just like all the different possibilities that can kind of exist. You sort of have to, once again, kind of rein yourself in a little bit and sort of say, okay, let's limit the options here a little bit. But the problem is, as I mentioned earlier, is that in many cases you have these national tenants that all have their own weird little quirky things that in order for them to occupy your space, they want. Well, you've got to somehow model that to then make it comparable to another tenant and to be able to really get a sense for, you know, what revenue that you're really receiving and what sort of liabilities that you have in terms of operating expenses or other issues, okay? All right, other questions, thoughts, comments? Okay, all right. So this next one is probably going to be the easiest thing you do in this class. Okay. So the folks that get this wrong need to go back to 4th grade mathematics. All right.
I missed that thing.
You're going to add those up, and you're going to divide by 5. Okay? So let's just see if we can manage to get through this without making a mistake. All right, so 25 plus 2550 plus 26, 2 plus 26. Okay, 131.40 overall, divided by 5, 26, 28 would be your average net rent. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay, now, that is just simply trying to give you, once again, kind of a dollars in sort of perspective of what your average rent would be over that time horizon, you know, if you were able to kind of predict out what the changes are going to be from one year to the next, which sometimes you're able to do, you know, sometimes you're not so much with CPI, but maybe other indices you might be able to do that. But the point being is, all right, so that gives you at least kind of a ballpark figure of what that average rent will be. Okay, everybody cool with that? Okay, now, the next phase is going to be.
Quick question.
Yep.
What happens if your area for whatever reason goes up to 30 as a market? Yeah, can you put in clause in your lease that says, hey, market goes up to?
Yeah, no, you can have it. You can have your lease that simply says every year, every 5 years, every 10 years, we're going to market to market. In other words, we are going to basically go out into the market and we're going to see what is competing similar space renting for on a per square foot basis, and then at that time, 5 years, whatever the term is, we can, you know, raise your rent accordingly. Now, tenants absolutely hate that, okay? Because you think about it, that once again, their rent can go from here, instead of just going, you know, like a little bitty, you know, sort of stair step, and all of a sudden just go, you know, up here, and in many cases they're not going to be prepared to be able to, you know, accommodate that additional cost. Here's something to think about. It used to be that the standard was if you had a retail store of any kind, okay, that you would simply say you should pay no more in rent than 10% of your gross sales, okay? That would be like literally you're selling, you know, candy bars and cookies and Cokes and whatever else, that whatever that gross dollar amount is, the purchase price the customer, you know, pays, only 10% should go toward rent. Because here's the thing, your cost of goods sold, you know, in a normal retail environment might be 40, 50, 60%, you know, of like what you have to pay for the product from your supplier. And so therefore, let's just say it's 50%, okay? Now, granted, margins have gotten a lot thinner over the years, but the point being is, let's just say it's 50%. So the product that you sell for $10, to keep it simple, then you're basically saying, of that $10, $5 was what my cost was as the retailer to my supplier. $1 out of that I could afford to put toward rent. And then that remaining $4 has to go to pay the employees, has to go to pay for any other sort of operating expenses and my profit. Okay? Well, what has happened obviously over time, and this is once again where you have many more failures of retailers, part of the reason is they no longer are able to achieve those margins. Okay? Now, their cost of goods sold, in order to be competitive with online retailers in many cases, their cost of goods sold might be closer to 80%. Okay? So in other words, that product they're selling for $10, their cost is maybe 80% or $8 of that. So that gives them a much smaller margin to potentially be able to spend on rent. So what you're seeing now is many of those retailers being forced to only pay maybe 5 to 7% at most for their rental space. And so this is also kind of an interesting thing to then be able to back into and sort of say that if you have a retail store and you are expecting it to do X number of dollars in sales, then that is the most that you of saying, well, I can only pay about 5 to 7% in rent, then that would, in essence, sort of tell you whether or not you really could afford to operate or not. Does that make sense?
Or operate at a specific location.
Right. Because that's another thing that sort of gets lost in all of this. Some retailers are very easily able to adjust their prices by geographic location. Other retailers, it begins to be a little bit more of a challenge, especially, one of the most famous, but one of the more recent ones that I saw was like Subway, okay, the sandwich shop. That, nationwide, they're running the what? $5 footlong, right? Okay? What's a nationwide, sort of product, promotion, okay? Well, if you're in Arkansas or you're in, somewhere in the Midwest, your rents are a heck of a lot cheaper, okay? Your, operating costs are a heck of a lot cheaper. So those retailers selling $5 footlongs in Arkansas are probably banking, and doing just fine. But you take that and you translate that to downtown New York City, and their cost is probably, $6 or $7, by the time everything is said and done, so they're losing money on the deal. So you follow what I'm sort of saying? And it's something that kind of gets lost in a lot of this is that, you really have to kind of, especially from a retailer's perspective, look at those differences and kind of how much of an impact.
On the other end of the spectrum, what do you see retailers that do a good job of adjusting regionally?
Well, probably Lowe's and Home Depot. To a certain extent, because they're, if you even get on their website, they will ask you, for your zip code, because the prices are going to be different for different parts of the country because of their sourcing of those materials, and they've got high transport costs and a whole number of other things that they do try to, take into account.
Publix too.
Yeah, same sort of thing, yeah. Okay, yep.
In the case of the Subway, just related for example, they may be losing money and maybe only the store is operated independently.
Right.
But if this operated like a, one
corporate store.
Corporate store.
Yeah, so they can basically allocate the cost over many stores. Okay, and actually, see, this is the sort of topic that I would love to spend a lot of time on because it's actually a really interesting one, which is what's called transfer pricing. Okay, and it applies to real estate as well, from the standpoint that, let's say that I own 5 different properties, much like the Subway or just a retail store, office building, doesn't really matter. And a simple example of this could be how I go about allocating the management of those facilities, like property management across those facilities, because whenever I'm preparing operating statements for those properties, maybe there's one of them I know that I want to sell, okay? And so what I potentially could do is to allocate all of my sort of managerial cost and expenses to the other 4, making this 5th one that I want to sell look a whole lot more attractive than what it really is, because I'm transferring those costs over to the other properties. Now, should I do that? Absolutely not. Okay, but the point being is that is, you know, sort of an example of how, you know, what you bring up about, well, okay, yeah, if it's a corporate-owned store, they can kind of make those sort of adjustments and just sort of say, as long as they're making a profit over however many stores they have across the country, that's okay. But, you know, when you get down into the weeds of, yeah, a franchisee that's located in, you know, as I said, like Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, wherever, compared to, you know, a more densely populated area, whole different, you know, price structure and cost structure.
I was just thinking that, that would be a really cool topic to use if you were talking about like maybe what's the average salary for the manager that's running the place, you know, are you gonna allocate that business out of the Midwest, or are you gonna do it out of Orlando, you know?
Right.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. All right, so the next one is basically going to be looking at the present value of your actual net rent. Okay, so here, this was not too terribly complicated either. This one is just going to be basically taking all of those rental amounts, putting them into a cash flow, and applying a discount rate, okay? To basically try to take into account the time value of money, all right? So let's say that we have a 5% discount rate. And this is obviously going to be annual, so 1 payment per year. We would just simply put in 5% as our interest rate, then we would put in 25, well actually we would put in 0 first. Put in 0 as our initial cash flow, then put in 25, $25.50, okay? And once we've got all of those put in, then we're going to simply solve for the net present value of those. Okay? Does that make sense?
You can put in IY whenever.
Yeah, you can put the interest rate per year at the, well, as long as you put it in before you solve for net present value. Okay? Yep. Okay. So the question from Miriam is, why do we put in the 0 as our initial cash flow? Okay. And I think I may or may not have talked a little bit about this previously, but I'll bring it up again, and that is, you could make the argument that if they were paying their rent up front at the beginning of the year for the whole year, then you could potentially put the 25 in as the initial cash flow. But what's actually happening is you're getting those payments monthly over the course of the year, and so that you're not really able to recognize that full $25 really until the end of the first year, okay? After all the bills have been paid, everything has been processed. And so this is something that with cash flows in general for real estate, that you pretty much make the assumption, and it's a conservative assumption, to say that you are not going to receive those cash flows and recognize those cash flows until the end of the period or end of the year. Now, if we were doing this on a monthly basis, 12 payments per year, we would also do it, in essence, you know, toward the end of the month, because we would still say, even though you may be getting the rent at the beginning of the month, it's going to probably sit in your bank account. You've got to pay operating expenses out of whatever that rent potentially is, and then you're not really going to realize it and recognize it until the end of the month. Okay? What, the zero here reflects right here, right now, today. Okay? This cash flow 1 is at the end of the first year, 12 months from now, is when you're recognizing that income. Okay? Even though it's being paid over the course of the year, you're not recognizing it from an accounting perspective until the end of the year. Okay? And this is a, for those of you that have taken San Miguel's class, hopefully he talked a little bit about recognizing, rental revenue. Okay? I mean, any thoughts to add to what I just said?
No, I mean, I follow.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. Question?
No, thanks.
So,
Okay.
this is just like an assumption that, like, there's no upfront payment at time of, like, signing or.
Yeah, so
It's just like an assumption that, like,
pretty
like
much
the
for
normal.
all normal
Okay.
real estate, you pretty much, whenever you're looking at it on an annual basis, okay, you're basically saying, okay, time period 0 is immediately right here, right now, today. Okay? Now, while you may get some of that rent, that first month today, you're not going to get the remainder of that money, accumulated until really the end of that first year. Okay? And so it's not going to be here until you are able to really recognize that $25 as being hard, cold cash that you get to keep or pay off to the tax man. Okay? All right? Okay. All right. Moving forward. All right, so let's do that real quick. Okay, and what do we get?
113.51?
I'm sorry?
113?
Yep, 113, like 51?
I get one too.
Well, okay, if you put it, make sure, well, hold on here. Yep, 1 payment per year. Make sure you get on 1 payment per year. Okay? Okay. Okay, so now, take this number, and in essence, this number is not equivalent to, but is similar to the 131.40. Okay? You're just simply saying, okay, this is now making it more, taking into account the time value of money factor, that if someone wanted to prepay all of their rent for the entire 5 years, instead of having them write you a check of $131.40 per square foot for that next 5 years, that you would give them basically the discount of only having to pay you $113.51 if they were to pay all sort of in one lump sum today. Or another way to look at it, that's what the value of it is to you today. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay. Now you're saying, would anyone ever prepay their rent like that? 5 years?
No.
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
The most I've seen is 2 years up front.
Yeah. Okay. So I have the ultimate story on this. Okay.
That's years.
So back, this would have been about 1998, 99, somewhere in there, right before the whole .com kind of, So what you had in Texas, you had property owners that were being approached to lease out office space by these .comers, all starting up their .com businesses for all sorts of manners and purposes. And these .com folks were getting, obviously, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars in startup capital, you know, that they were then, you know, immediately, you know, plowing into their businesses to become the new whatever craze it was at that particular point in time. But the property owners, many of them being, you know, old school, and once again, you put yourself back, you know, 20 years, okay, from where we are now, go back in time 20 years, all right? And back then, certainly was the case that most real estate owner-operators were not the most tech-savvy people, okay? Many of them today are still not the most tech-savvy people, okay? And so these folks were like trying to understand these dot-com businesses and couldn't understand. You know, how is it you're getting all this money and you're not really selling anything? You're giving it away. I don't really understand how that makes any sense and how that could be sustainable and blah, 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 blah. And so these property owners were saying, I don't think I really want to lease space to you, you know, because you may be in business today and you may have a pocket full of money now, but I just don't think you're going to be able to pay the rent, you know, a couple of years down the road. And so what they did, pretty much en masse, especially in North Texas and the Richardson area, most all the property owners up there kind of banded together to a certain extent and said, okay, look, we're going to require these guys to prepay their rent anywhere from 5 years in advance to 10 years in advance, okay, if they wanted to occupy their space. And so it's exactly what happened. So, and then, as you can imagine, a year or so later, you know, property went dark, another property goes dark, another property goes dark, another property goes dark, because all these businesses are going out of business. The property owners are sitting back laughing at the whole thing, saying, hey, you know, we got prepaid in rent for, you know, 5 years, 10 years, so we're okay. And, you know, so no big deal. So it's just kind of an interesting, you know, thing that, but the point thing is that they were, you know, would say, yeah, we'd be willing to, you know, take a little bit of a discount if you know, do that prepayment for us, but, you know, it's just, all I can say is, yes, it does happen, okay? All right, questions?
So startups where you have a hard time figuring out their business model, that's maybe a good idea to go.
Yeah, get a little prepaid rent, especially if they've got the capital. I mean, it just seems like a good business, and it was on the part of you know, these old timers that are just sort of saying, you know, hey, I just want to make sure I get paid.
Right.
And this business you're describing to me doesn't make any sense.
Hey, you know, it's kind of like Warren Buffett was talking about how, you know, for all of the yeses he said, you know, there's like 99 no's, and you know, he talks about, look, you know, in baseball you got to swing at every pitch, but when you're investing, you don't have to swing at every pitch, you know, and if it doesn't make sense, you don't have to swing at it.
Right. Nope, very true. Hey.
I was the real property manager for the properties at our embassy over in Malton. We had 20, 25 apartments we rented. We were competing against online gaming. We had a big online gaming industry there. And those guys would come in, lots of money, and you know, they rent. So we were allowed to request up to 2 years rent up front to pay for properties. But our leases are written in such a way that if we wanted to get out of it, even though we paid years in advance, we could, and just say, well, we want to get out. And then it wasn't, we didn't even have to do it for cause. We could just say, okay, we want to end this lease. And we give them 3 months in advance, and they have to take all that money back.
Yep. Yeah, the other sort of post note to the Texas story, it's kind of interesting, I guess, in and of itself, is sort of during that 5-10 year sort of period immediately following, you know, those prepaid leases where the tenants left. Well, in some of those leases, in many of them, the property owner was allowed to immediately release the property and keep the money. But in other leases, if they did release the property, then they would be required to pay it back. Okay, so there were some interesting, weird, quirky things going on, that you had properties that obviously were leased, the money had been paid, but they were basically just sitting empty, sitting dark, and not being included in the inventory of available space. And so it had some really screwy effects, you know, on things, because it's like, you know, a few years later, then all of a sudden, you know, all this property comes to the market, and everybody's like, what the hell? You know, where did all this property come from? It was all because of these, you know, spaces that had prepaid their rent, And so, you know, a real mismatch in terms of supply and demand. So, you know, there's some really, you know, strange things that can happen whenever you know, obviously have circumstances like that. Yeah.
This is a little bit different topic. So, for stores like Spirit Halloween that are only around for like the month of October, how do they put their rent up front? Like, how do they operate? Because they really just.
That's a good question, and in some cases, they may pay an exorbitant amount for the short-term lease that they get. It may even be like double or more what an ordinary lease rate might be, just because, you know, they are only occupying that space for, you know, 2 or 3 months. But the idea is that their sales are going to be so massive, you know, during that period, that the property owner wants to sort of capitalize on that, and also knowing that that is going to eat up that space, you know, for those few months and take it off the market, you know, from, you know, some other perspective. But in most cases, most of the spaces, you know, the businesses like that, whether it's the Christmas stores, the Halloween stores, or whatever it might be, that, you know, those are, you know, just known to be, you know, seasonal sort of things, and then the property owners will just, you know, rent them space real, you know, at an expensive rate. But also, usually most of those spaces are not the ideal spaces to begin with. You know, in terms of spaces that are really going to do all that well any other time of the year, but during those, you know, short little, you know.
I know the Spirit Halloween where I'm from, every year they rent out, well, not every year, but like generally like the size store that H.H. Gregg used to be at, so it's pretty big, and it's just like Spirit Halloween's not that big. So I'm like, how do they get the like able to lease in that space when it's so huge? Like, I wouldn't want to do that if I were the landlord. I'm like just sitting here for a month, so that's why I was wondering how to do that every year.
When you say that in that type of case, an empty building is not making any money, it's
Right.
just sitting
But
there
I would
empty,
find
so
somebody that can
like utilize
be
your
there.
capacity.
Like, yeah, but I would find a company that's more permanently can be there for 5.
But there's just not
But
necessarily.
you're not making money during
But
that
the
time.
whole point is that there's maybe not that much demand for that space to begin with,
Okay.
because it's not necessarily a premium space.
Okay.
You know, unless you had some,
I mean, there's
without getting, you know, going too far down the rabbit hole on this, but you know, you know, let's say that maybe you had like a major retailer that moved out of actually a pretty decent space, and then, you know, just looking for an interim use just to get some, you know, revenue in the short term before that next new tenant can potentially, you know, be found. Okay. All right. Moving forward. Yep.
How do we determine that discount rate when we're doing this
Okay.
calculation?
So it's going to be given to you, first of all, but in terms of reality,
Exactly.
okay, in terms of reality, this is really going to be determined by kind of the owner's cost of capital, okay? So the owner would sort of set that sort of threshold of, that, in other words, another way to sort of look at it is the owner could sort of say, if I were to take this amount and pretty much put it in a savings account and then just draw out this amount at the end of the first year, draw out this amount, and so forth, that savings account would need to earn, let's say, 4% to be equivalent to that. It's another way of sort of looking at it. Okay? But also, you could have an owner that's really greedy, you know, which is going to be probably more often, and then they would simply say, well, we're going to demand a much higher discount rate, maybe 10%. Well, that means this number, you know, potentially, you know, is going to be a little bit lower, but then, you know, in terms of the rate of return that they're going to be able to get. So, I mean, it's a question of how you want to look at it. Okay, moving on. All right. So the next one I think I entitled, let's see here, effective net rent. Okay. All right, so for this one, you're basically going to use the information from what we just did. Once again, one payment per year. Catch that, Chris? All right.
There's a backstory there.
All right. You're going to put in 113, all right, 51, and you're going to put that in as your present value. This is going to be occurring over 5 years. and you're gonna put in your discount rate of the 5%, and then you're gonna solve for payment. So that's going to give us basically a yearly equivalent, okay? So $26.22 is going to be our effective net rent. And so if you look at that number, it's not that different than the number we got up here, just in our simple little calculation. And part of the reason it's not that different is because we have a relatively low discount rate. If that discount rate were substantially higher, that difference would be that much more dramatic, okay? But all this simply represents is, from a time value of money perspective, that would be the rate that we would need to charge each year if we wanted it to be a stable rate and not change from one year to the next, but yet still give us the overall rate of return that we're desiring, okay? So, like I said, here's what I guess I'm trying to get at. You have some tenants, they simply want to know what their lease rate is going to be maybe for the whole term of the property. They don't want any changes. They just want to know, all right, boom, this is my lease rate for this year, for next year, for the following year, you know, for whatever my term is. We're not going to have any escalations. We're not going to have any of this other stuff. And they demand that. And then you as a property owner says, okay, we can do that. So basically, you go through and you do this sort of a calculation, and you say, okay, well, I guess that rate's going to be basically 26.22. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Okay. All right, moving forward here. Okay. All right. Now, if you remember, one of the other things that we sort of did kind of at the very beginning of all of this, probably on the first day of class even, we talked about kind of an operating statement. And we said we sort of start off with like potential gross income, we subtract out what, vacancy and collection losses, we add in other income, that gives us effective gross income, we subtract out total operating expenses, and that gives us net operating income. Everybody pretty much remember that from the first day? Okay, so now we're going to be actually using that to come up with basically a solution at least for the net operating income. All right, so let's just say we've got a commercial property and it is generating how much per month, or I'm sorry, how much per year in rent?
It's called $30.
Okay, so you're going to say $30 per square foot per month. I'm sorry, per year.
Yeah.
All right. So $30 per square foot per year. All right. How many square feet do we have?
2,500.
25. That's a small property.
25,000.
Oh, okay, 25,000. Much better. All right. So 25,000 square feet. All right. Times the $30 per square foot per year. Okay. 750,000. Okay. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Then from that property, we're going to have maybe a certain percentage of vacancy and collection losses. Give me a percent. 10. Okay. Somebody wants to keep the math simple. All right. 10% would just simply be 75,000. It would subtract out. Okay. 750,000 times 10% would be 75,000. Okay. So once again, we're just saying vacancies and collection losses equal 10% of potential gross income, the assumption we're making, okay? All right, other income. Now, depending on what kind of property it is, we talked a little bit about this. What are the random, weird sources of other income that we might have, depending on the property type?
Laundry machines.
Okay, laundry machines, vending machines, parking fees, billboards and signage that may be on the property, a whole number of things. Okay, so what dollar amount we want to throw in there? What? For a $750,000 PGI, only $1,000 in other income? Come on.
50,000.
50.
Okay, let's at least do, yeah, something a bit more reasonable. Oops, no, that's not gonna be a negative.
That's a plus.
All right, so let's just make sure, once again, 750,000 minus 75,000 plus 50,000 gives us 725 grand. Okay, we good? All right. Total operating expenses, okay? So depending on what we pass through to the tenants and what we retain as the property owner to expense, give me a percentage.
35.
Okay, so 35%. So we're gonna take that 725,000 times 35% for our total operating expenses. And that is going to be 253,750. Okay, and we're going to subtract that from the 725, which gives us 471,250 as our NOI. Okay, everybody good? Okay. Any questions? All right. Okay. Now, let's take a look. All right, so that gives us our annual net operating income, so I think we're good with that. So nothing accomplished that feat. Let's move on to the next topic, which in this case, multiple tenants, rentable area per floor load factors. Whew, a mouthful. All right. So in this particular case, we talked a little bit about this, I think last week, when we were talking about net buildable area or net leasable area versus gross building area and that sort of thing. You guys remember that sort of discussion? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. When we talk about the dimensions of the room and sort of saying, okay, the interior space is 1 square footage, the exterior space, is basically a different calculation. Well, we can also have basically leasable area versus usable area. Is that right? That's what I read?
Yeah.
I don't know why it didn't look right. Okay. Leasable area versus usable area. Okay. Which one's going to be bigger? Leasable area is going to be bigger than usable area. Okay. Usable area, the simple sort of way to think of it is this interior room space. Okay. The leasable area, as we sort of talked about, you're also going to be leasing common areas, like the hallways and things like that you may be responsible for, or it could be that if you're, especially even if you're a single tenant on a floor, you're still going to have elevators and stairways and that sort of thing. You're still going to have to pay rent on, okay? Or at least in most properties, you're still going to have to pay rent on. And so what we're looking for here is, let's say that we've got a situation of where the overall leasable area, just to keep things simple, is a floor plate for the entire floor of 10,000 square feet. But the usable area is maybe, I don't know, 9,250 square feet. Okay? So something a little bit less. All right? So to get what we're looking for here, which is what is called sort of a load factor, you're simply going to take the 10,000 divided by the 9,250, and that's going to be 1.081, okay?
And that is gonna be our
Load factor.
The load factor. Now, how you're going to potentially use that, depending on how the property is sort of set up, that it may say, okay, you're renting this space, you're renting this room, okay? And let's just for simplicity's sake, saying this room is 9,250 square feet, okay? But we are requiring you to add on this load factor for this space exterior to the property, so that that is actually going to be the total square footage that we're going to charge you for in terms of the leasable square feet. Does that make sense? So in other words, your interior calculation was 9,250. You thought, just put things into the proper perspective, you thought you were leasing 9,250 square feet, but the property owner is saying, no, no, no. With this load factor, you are really leasing 10,000 square feet. Does that make sense? So that is what then your lease rate is going to be based off of, the 10,000. Okay? Make sense? Okay. Not a big deal, but I just want to make sure we throw it out there. Okay. Okay, common area maintenance. Somewhat of a related topic, but yet different. Okay. First of all, what is common area maintenance?
A quick question. Would it be unnormal, not normal to include parking areas as part of the leasable area?
No, parking is usually done as a totally separate sort of thing. This is really just exclusively looking at what is the actual occupiable space of the building. Now, if you wanted to get into, I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen any of them done like this, but usually with parking lots, you may sell a space, but you're not necessarily going to tack on a load factor. You're just going to simply say it's going to be X number of dollars per parking space to either rent it, to own it, to whatever it might be. So they're usually not going to get into the load factor. Basically, here's the logic behind the load factor thing. The logic is the property owner is trying to get as much rent as they can.
Right.
Okay, and so they're just coming up with all sorts of mechanisms, okay, it's a polite way of saying scams, but mechanisms to, in essence, extract that much more money out of their prospective tenants. And so so the argument they're making is, yeah, you're occupying the space, but you're also going to be going out into the hallways and down the hallways, or using elevators and things like that. And so we want to get paid back for that as well.
Yeah. But you go to some shopping centers and you see like signs that says for this particular
Right.
business parking.
Yeah, and normally, yeah, that is it's going to be an extra add-on on top of whatever then the rent per square foot would be.
That's really interesting too, because based on the uses in the shopping centers, they're required to have certain amounts of parking spaces
Yes.
for your use. And in large shopping centers, typically, like, the municipality will require each, like, when you get your business tax, you're supposed to show that you can accommodate parking. So most shopping centers, you have enough parking spaces, and people don't even really take advantage of calling it theirs most of the time as well.
Yeah, the parking space thing is been a really, well, it's always been kind of a hot button issue, but for retail users, well, it's going to be expanded. Like the thing about a mixed use property, okay? If you've got a mixed use property where you've got retail on the ground floor, you've got some apartments maybe on, some of the middle floors, but then on top of that, you've got some office space or whatever it might be, all in the same building. Well, how do you go about determining parking ratios or something like that? Because the people that are living in the apartments may be at work off-site somewhere, so they're driving their car, during the day. So basically the people that are coming in and working there, driving their car to replace their car. But But then you have the retail spaces that may only be open for, excuse me, a certain number of hours, maybe around lunchtime or dinner where you've got high demand. And so it gets really complicated really quick. But to your point, pretty much every municipality, sets fairly specific standards for X number of parking spaces per X number of square feet of retail space or office space or residential units or whatever it may be. But obviously, one of the things that people are now beginning to take advantage of, or especially in densely populated urban areas, are things like Uber. And it's not any secret to anybody, but that's having an impact, on the need for parking spaces at a lot of different, structures and a lot. And so, you sort of can take that and extrapolate a little bit further. Well, what about once we have the self-driving cars that we've been hearing about for many years that I'm expecting that we will all see in our lifetimes? I can't imagine that not within, another 5 to 10 years, that's going to be much more commonplace. Well, then what happens then, to all those parking requirements and ratios whenever that car can just be circling around town just waiting to pick up the next, or it just goes back home and parks itself in your garage or whatever it is. And, so I mean, it's kind of funny to think about, but yet at the same time, many things that we are completely accustomed to now, you think about how those technology evolutions, have been dramatic, certainly within my lifetime, of going from, the only phone you had access to was a corded phone in your house without an answering machine to, what we have now at our fingertips with us all the time. I mean, it's hard sometimes, reconcile some of that stuff. But anyway, all right. Other questions about the parking thing before we move on to the common area maintenance piece? Okay. So one of the things that a property owner wants to have in place, whether or not you're dealing with retail tenants, or you're dealing with office tenants, or pretty much any other type of tenant, is to come up with yet another charge that you can offload onto your tenants. And one of those would be common area maintenance. And so this is where the parking potentially would be, sort of included and saying, hey, we all share a parking lot, and we are going to maybe divide that up based upon the square footage, within a particular shopping center or a particular office building or whatever it is, and you're going to pay a proportional fee to maintain that. You're going to pay a proportional fee to maintain the landscaping on the property, to maintain, the cleaning crews to come in every, day to the property and to do their thing. Whatever it is that needs to be routinely, maintained on the property, there's going to be this extra fee. Now, this fee can be massive, okay, depending on the kind of property that you're sort of dealing with. And in some cases, those common area maintenance fees can get pretty darn close to reaching what your actual rent is on the property, depending on how much stuff they're cramming into that common area maintenance charge. Yeah.
Do you know what the governing document for
it's going to be the lease. Well, I mean, okay. Yeah, it's going to be the individual. I mean, if you have a single owner for the property, okay, it's not condominiumized ownership, but if you have a single owner for the property, then they, within their individual lease documents that they're going to provide to the tenants, they're going to say, your fee for common area maintenance is going to be a precise dollar amount, or it's going to be based on maybe your percentage of total square footage or whatever it might be.
So then, that's something I haven't seen before, is the condominium knowledge.
Yep.
You said,
Yep.
Industrial properties, so in that instance, it would be the condo knowledge.
Yep. Yep. Who's responsible for what? Yep. Okay. So let's just say we've got two different types of tenants, maybe within our, let's say, retail, that we've got our big tenant, anchor tenant, thank you. And we have kind of our inline sort of retail tenants that sort of surround the anchor tenant. So this would be kind of a, think like a Publix grocery store is the anchor tenant, and then all the little superfluous shops of whether they're like a Subway or a tanning salon or a little bank or a, you know, whatever that are kind of adjacent to the Publix, okay, would be the inline retail tenants. So let's assume that for this property on an annual basis, that the common area maintenance costs are, give me a dollar amount. Let's do it on a just overall dollar amount.
50,000.
Oh, let's make it a little bit higher.
3 million.
200,000.
3 million. Wow.
3 million?
It's a big building, it's 800 square.
Let's just, once
That's
again,
like Brickell City Center.
okay, let's do $1 million. Okay, nice round math. Okay, so $1 million total common area maintenance charges. Now, here is where the anchor tenant may pay a smaller dollar amount in those fees based on their square footage than what the inline tenants pay. In other words, they're getting a price break, not only probably in their rent, but also in the common area maintenance charges, okay? Because they're just, we're saying, we're a big tenant, we're driving obviously the customers to the site. These inline tenants, they're just kind of like parasites feeding off of us. So, you know, we're going to obviously get the better deal, and we're going to pass on a lot of the costs of those common area maintenance to the inline tenants, okay? All right, so let's just say that the anchor tenant will take $400,000 all right, so that means $600,000 is going to be left to the inline tenants. Okay, but let's say that with these inline tenants, that we've got, just to keep things simple, 60,000 square feet of space. Okay, you're with me?
Total for all of them?
Yep, for all of them combined. So the simple math would be taking the 600,000 divided by the 60,000, and we would just be saying, all right, your total common area maintenance charges are going to be $10 per square foot per year for the inline tenants. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Just as an example. Okay. Thoughts, questions, observations?
For example, if you have a Publix, for example, in a Home Depot,
Where you have both in the same center?
Yes.
Well, they're both going to be considered anchors, and probably are both going to have maybe somewhat similar deals, depending on, because they're going to be also, I mean, think about it in one sense, depending on, it gets really complicated because, like, a Lowe's or a Home Depot, you know, is a very rough finish out. Not a lot of refrigeration units, you know, of any sort, you know, really it's just pretty much a big open warehouse. Whereas you take a Publix, much higher finish out, you know, in terms of flooring, in terms of features. You've got all the extra power consumption needs for all of those coolers and refrigerators and things like that. So, you know, it's a much high, probably going to be a higher cost, not only to operate, but more specifically, you may have a higher investment on the part of the property owner in that space, probably charging them a higher rate per square foot than you might charge the Home Depot folks. Okay? All right. Moving on. Any questions? Pretty straightforward.
Here the question was, how much do the inline tenants pay per square foot?
That's not relevant to this question. I mean, you can ask the question, but it's not relevant to the question because here all we're just looking at is just what is their common area maintenance charge. Okay? They could have, I mean, yeah, we could say that they pay, I don't know, $20 per square foot per year in rent, so their total bill would be $30 per square foot
Depends
per
what
year.
type of lease, if it's a net
Right.
lease or what.
Right.
Is CAM always included, is that netted out ever?
Yeah, I mean, normally it's going to be a separate charge because the property owner wants to make the property look as attractive as possible.
Right.
So the number that they're really quoting to everyone is just the base rent. Okay? They're almost never going to quote the common area maintenance charge to you, you know, until you're really almost there at the signing table and, you know, willing to commit to this lease then all of a sudden you find out, oh, yeah, I've got another, wow, another 30% of expenses on top of what I thought I was paying to have to pay for.
Is that bill at the end of the year?
I'm sorry?
Is that reconciled at the end of the year?
It depends. In many cases, they'll just simply try to take a percentage of it each month, just like they would with the rent, because otherwise it'd be a big lump sum that you as a tenant would have to come up with, and they don't want to take the risk of you not paying that. So in most instances, they're just going to allocate it along with your rent. Okay? Other questions, comments, observations on that?
Gross leases don't have a CAM charge?
A true gross lease would not. I mean, you know, if it was an extreme gross lease, but you could have a gross lease with a CAM charge if they were, once again, isolating out that particular feature. It wouldn't automatically convert it into a net lease. It would push it closer to being a net lease. Okay? Because you can have what's basically called like a modified gross or whatever that includes certain things. It's just, that's what I'm saying, it's a continuum. And you know, you're either going to be closer over here to this side of it, or you're going to be closer to this side, and so, you know, it's really where you're kind of like right in the middle as to whether you're really calling it a gross or calling it a net. Okay, moving on.
To give you context, it's really like the most, just on the marketing side, what people mean by triple net lease here, always ask them, because they don't necessarily mean absolute. I mean, no joke. You always have to ask for these terms, because
I'd like to put that on the sale price, but it's not really.
Ask them for the terms, because when they say triple net here, they don't necessarily mean that. Or the other one, gross, they not necessarily mean that.
Okay, moving on. Percentage rents. Okay, so once again, another type of lease that exists out there for almost exclusively retail tenants are percentage rents. So this is the sort of thing where you're normally going to have a base amount for the rent. So let's just start off with that. What's going to be the base amount per square foot per year for a retail tenant? 25. $25 per square foot per year as base rent. So every tenant is going to pay that, all right? But then we're going to have this percentage rent provision, okay? But it's not necessarily going to be just a fixed percentage on a certain dollar amount. So let's just, okay, how big is this shopping center? Let's say it's 10,000 square feet, okay, not a big one. All right, and in this particular center, how many dollars per square foot are we going to do in sales per year? Let's say $500 a square foot in sales. Okay? So $500 per square foot per year in sales. Okay? All right? So, right here. Okay, so 10,000 times 500. Yep, 5 million. Okay. Total retail sales. Gross retail sales. All right. Everybody cool with that? Yes or no? Mm-hmm. All right. So out of that 5 million, we may want to sort of say, as the property owner, we're thinking, all right, we want to participate in as much of the pie as we can, but we also don't want to necessarily, you know, bankrupt the tenant. But we also know that the tenant's sales are cyclical. In other words, certain times of the year they're going to be really high, other times of the year they're going to be really low. You know, the normal, traditional retail tenant, your sales were the highest in the what months? November and December, okay? Because everybody buying stuff for the holidays and that sort of thing, okay? And so what you would see would be obviously a huge spike, you know, in sales at that time of the year. So the tenant could afford to pay more in rent during those couple of months, then they would be able to maybe pay in the middle of July, okay? Make sense? All right, so what you might do is say, okay, tenants will pay 15% of, that's probably a bit high. Tenant will pay, let's say 10%. We'll pay 10% of gross sales receipts above $3 million, okay, as percentage rent. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? So what's going to happen for this particular tenant, they're not going to pay any percentage rent on their first $3 million worth of sales. But when they go over $3 million, it's going to kick in, and so for that final, in this case, $2 million worth of sales, they're going to pay 10% of that as their percentage rent. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
In addition to the.
In addition to the $25 per square foot for rent. Okay, so here's what you're going to do. You're basically going to take the $3 million, subtract it from the $5 million, which is going to give you $2 million. Multiply that by 10%, which is going to be 200,000. Okay, and that's going to be your percentage rent charged or paid. By the tenant. Okay, does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, but what we're going to do is we want to find out maybe what their overall effective rent is. So we're going to take the $25 per square foot, multiply it by the 10,000 or 10,000 square feet. Should be 250,000, right? Always double checking. So 250,000 would be our base rent, plus the 200,000 of percentage rent. So our total rent would be 450,000. Does everybody see that?
Yep.
And then you would divide that, the 450,000, divided by the 10,000, to basically say that your effective rent would be $45 per square foot per year. Okay? Everybody cool with that? All right. So, just to kind of do the simple math, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier. So what percentage is this overall rent payment of their gross sales? So 450,000 divided by 5 million, 9%. Okay, remember what I was talking about earlier? That probably, and you know, that you probably not want to pay more than 10% was kind of the old standard. Maybe the new standard is probably closer to 4 to 7%. But we're still somewhere within the boundaries of reasonableness. Okay, make sense?
But as the owner or as a landlord, this is a way that you can get a lot more money.
Absolutely.
Yeah, without giving all the risk to the tenant.
Right.
If
You see, you also have an incentive. Think about it like this. This also, with that percentage rent, this is a big key thing to not miss out on. You're saying, well, why would the tenant even agree to such a thing? Well, think about it like this. if you're the tenant paying me, the property owner, this percentage rent, I, as the owner, have more incentive to maintain the property well, to promote the property, to drive traffic to the property, than if I'm just getting a flat, base rent. Think about it like this from a shopping mall perspective, okay? Now, obviously, shopping malls now are beginning to, becoming sick and beginning to die, but you think about, a lot of the big ones, what do? They start adding in all these other entertainment features, all these other things to try to draw traffic into them, and part of that is, driven by this need to try to boost up sales because that could potentially work in their favor as the owner of the property to generate that much more revenue in their back pocket, okay? Make sense? Okay.
This 200,000 extra is only during the months where they make over 3 million.
Well, no, it's going to be overall. What's going to more than likely happen is that once you're going to go through the year.
Oh, I see.
And once you reach that $3 million threshold, you're not going to be paying any additional rent. But once you reach that threshold, then it's going to kick in.
But you'd only know that at the end of the year, right? I mean,
right. But that's my point. But it's like you're not going to be paying that overage until you get there.
Okay.
Normally. Okay?
Yeah, and imagine if these kind of setups have a real economy of scale, if I'm not mistaken, because if you have like 15, 20 tenants, right, then you have, one hell of an incentive to pull traffic in.
Right. But you also think about if the normal, not that it always happens this way, but just if the normal lease were to be initiated January the 1st, just to kind of put things in perspective here for a moment, you pretty much would be, in this case, 3/5 of the way through the year before the tenant would start to be charged that percentage rent, okay? Or, 3/5 of the year in the sense of sales. But if the majority of their sales are actually occurring in like November, December, they may not pay any percentage rent until those 2 months.
But did you just calculate the difference in annual difference right there, though?
Right. But that's what I'm saying. That's an overall number.
I see.
Month by month, we're not getting into.
So would it be required that the tenant open the book to?
Yes. Yeah, as a matter of fact, what normally they're going to do is they're going to use the sales tax receipts that are being submitted and certified to the state.
Other stuff.
Yep. Here in Florida, is it called the Comptroller's Office or is it called something else? State Treasury or just some other? In Texas, it's called the Texas State Comptroller's Office, and they're the ones that collect all the sales tax receipts. Here, I honestly don't know what it's called. Okay, moving forward. All right, Capex improvement allowances. Okay, this is a pretty super easy one. Here, so capital expenditures or Capex. Here we've got a simple example of a property that maybe has an effective gross income. You've got total operating expenses, and then we're going to have a Capex allowance, and then we're going to calculate net operating income. All right, so for the property, let's assume an effective gross income, give me a dollar amount. 500,000. All right, and our total operating expenses maybe are 200,000. Okay, and then our Capex, in this case, capital expenditures are different from normal operating expenses in that they are typically kind of a one-time sort of charge for like replacing carpet, repairing a roof, or putting in new windows, doing some sort of a renovation, that sort of thing. So Capex is not a normal recurring expense. It's kind of an upfront charge that you've got to pay to usually replace something in a significant way. So in this case, we're going to say for this particular property, maybe it's $100,000 for this particular year. All right, so we subtract out, and then we are left with a net operating income of $200,000. Okay, so the whole purpose of this problem is just to recognize, because most of the time, we almost never talk about Capex, okay? Almost all of our attention is really paid on operating expenses for property. Capex is really going to come into play whenever you've got a property that is up and running and you've owned it for a long period of time, and you're probably going to have these expenditures that you're going to have to make on that property to, you know, if it's like a residential property, every 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is, you're going to replace air conditioning units or replace, you know, dishwashers or, you know, roofs or carpet or whatever it might be, and you sort of build those in to the analysis. But this, you really could merit a lot of discussion in the sense that whenever you buy a property, in many cases, we spend a lot of time evaluating what the operating expenses are, but we don't, in many cases, do a great job of really factoring in a lot of those deferred maintenance / upcoming capital expenditures that we're going to be facing, okay? I mean, to use a simple analogy, you know, on like a car. If you own a car and you know that you're going to, just within a matter of a few months, you're going to put brand new tires, you're going to have to put a brand new transmission, you're going to have to, you know, do all sorts of other repairs to your vehicle. You know, if you're like me, you tend to think, okay, if that starts happening, and I know that's going to happen, I want to unload this vehicle so that somebody else has to deal with that problem, okay? And the same sort of thing is true with real estate, okay? That if you've got an owner that has owned that property for a good number of years, and all of a sudden they know all of this stuff is about to hit the fan with regard to repairs and maintenance and upkeep things that they haven't really been doing a good job of, yeah, they're going to probably want to unload that property. And then, now you as the prospective buyer, you know, you come in, you do your inspections. Now, if you do a good job with your inspections, you're going to identify pretty much all of that stuff and figure out, yeah, I'm going to have to replace this, I'm going to have to replace that. You know, you factor that into your, you know, purchase price and so forth. But if you get a naive sort of investor that sort of comes along and they don't really know what they're doing, then they potentially can get stuck with, you know, all of those sort of deferred maintenance issues, because you're not required really to disclose, you're required to disclose defects, but that's different than deferred maintenance. You know, there's a big difference, okay? You're not required to say, okay, my roof is X number of years old, my refrigerators and my units are X number of years old, the carpet is X number of years old, and so forth, okay? Now, what you are required to disclose would be something like, yeah, there's a massive leak on the property, and we can't get it fixed, and it's, you know, going to destroy, you know, virtually all of the foundation, you know, in the property, all the wood is rotted, and, you know, that sort of, yes. You would need to disclose. Okay, moving forward. All right, everybody cool with that? Yes?
Is it possible to have the operating expenses and the Capex exceed the
yes.
gross income?
Yes. Then you would have a loss.
Yeah, an annual loss. But you could be saving money.
No, and that actually that gets into basically the next course that you guys will take with me, which is the investments course, which is beginning to then classify things as repairs and maintenance versus classifying as Capex, because the tax treatment's different on each one. So that's for another class. Okay, moving forward.
One at a time. That's right.
Okay, so next topic, changing chapters. This one should go pretty quick, believe it or not. All right.
So for Capex, it's just we're gonna know the value of what we have.
Yeah. So, okay, think of it like this. Sometimes I give you a gift. Accept the gift. Okay. You know, don't try to make it more complex than that. All right. All right. Moving on. All right. So the next chapter, pretty much all about valuation. All right. In this case, we're going to look at the three primary approaches to value and kind of talk a little bit about those and some different issues. All right. So valuation. All right. We have three primary different approaches to value whenever we're looking at valuing real estate. The first one is going to be the sales comparison approach. We'll talk about that here in a minute. We have the cost approach, also called maybe replacement value. And we have the income approach. Okay. Just out of curiosity, because I know, once again, everybody has a totally different background when we're coming into a class like this. How many of you have seen or heard of the 3 approaches to value before coming into class today? Okay. So at least 30%. Okay. All right. So the other 70% of you have never seen this before. All right. Now, when you're looking to come up with a value for a piece of real estate, these are the 3 approaches to value that have been used for many, 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 many years, whether it's a residential property, commercial property, industrial property, mixed-use property, you know, institutional property, whatever it might be. But what takes place is you're going to use all 3 approaches, but you're going to tend to probably give dominance to one or the other depending on the type of use that you're actually valuing. And you'll understand what I'm talking about here in a second. So let's just take the sales comparison approach and what you're actually doing here. So applying the sales comparison approach, you are looking at sales that have occurred in the market over the past, let's say, 6 months or a year or so, depending on the kind of property that you're actually trying to value. If it's a residential property, single-family residential, you're going to be trying to look at sales that have only occurred within the past couple of months. Because the further and further that you go back, the less those values may be reflective of what the value is today, okay? Because market conditions have changed and that sort of thing. Well, the problem that you run into with commercial properties is trying to find a similar property that has actually sold within the past 6 months, 12 months, year, 5 years even in some cases, okay? In some markets, you may have situations of where there has never, ever been a sale of that particular type of commercial property that has ever occurred, okay? Then you're sort of forced to look at maybe competing markets, you know, to try to find, you know, something. But the one thing is, the further and further you get away from, in time and in space, from that subject property you're trying to value, the more and more you begin to kind of discount it and say it's really probably not, you know, that relevant. Okay, does that make sense? But for, as I said, for residential properties, where you've got, you know, a residential subdivision and virtually every home is built by the same builder, is built around the same time period, has roughly the same sort of features built into it, you know, has the same pretty much amenities and so forth. It makes it relatively easy to just sort of say, okay, all of these are pretty much the same with variations, and we try to take into account some of those variations to establish what the market value of that property is going to be today. Does that make sense conceptually? Yes or no? Okay? I would argue that the sales comparison approach is kind of looking at, it's a historical view of the value, a past view of the value of the property. Okay? The cost approach, or the replacement approach, this is where you would go and you would say, okay, how much would it cost me to actually rebuild this property? Okay? Rebuild it in terms of the size, in terms of the scope, in terms of the materials, in terms of, you know, everything to basically replicate it from, you know, what it, you know, currently is to what it is now. Now the problem that you run into there is, yeah, you can go and, like we, you know, sort of, you know, showed you a week or two ago of looking up online, you know, what construction cost might be for a particular property type. You know, it's really kind of honing in on the unique features that may be associated with this property. But more importantly, the biggest problem you're going to have with applying the cost approach is dealing with properties that are not new. Okay? Because if you've got a building that's maybe 10 years old, or 15 years old, or 30 years old, or 100 years old, you know, how do you go about really coming up with an accurate representation of what it's going to cost to replace that structure, because some of the building materials that may have been used 50 years ago, you can no longer use, or they're no longer available, or they cost too much, or the skill set needed to install them no longer exist, or all sorts of issues there. But the general idea behind the cost approach is that you really are looking at what it would cost me to basically replace this structure on this parcel. Now you're going to make adjustments for basically the deterioration of the property, any sort of issues. We're going to talk a little bit about this. Obsolescence of kind of unusual features that are maybe no longer needed or no longer relevant, in today's market that maybe were at one point in time, and making adjustments for that. Okay, which leads us to the third, and actually there's what we sort of say, but the cost approach is kind of what I would tend to kind of call, this is the value today. If we were to build it today, this is the value today. Okay, the income approach, this is where you're anticipating what the rental income is going to be on the property in the future, or in the case of single-family residential, what are the sales going to be in the future in terms of the dollar value of those sales based on expectations of changing dynamics within the market, applying growth rates and that sort of thing. But on the commercial side of the business, which is really where we're focused on, this is the most important approach to value. It's a future-looking value. It's saying, okay, what if we buy this property today, what can we rent it for today that is going to generate all of this income for me for many years into the future, and then what am I going to be able to maybe sell it for at some point in the future, and how much is all of that worth to me, okay, in today's market? But it's a future-looking sort of value in the sense that the information for it, you're sort of getting from estimates, in the future. Does that make sense? Okay? Another just little thing to sort of think of there is, yeah, you're having to predict what those rent rates are going to be, what those expenses are going to be, and all those things out into the future for this income approach. And it's in some cases a real challenge, especially if you have a property that doesn't have, like with those CVSs, if you got a 25-year lease in place, that makes it pretty darn easy to figure out what your income stream is. It's a pretty rock solid, lease rate. But what if you've got a property that you've got tenants constantly moving in, moving out, and moving on, and potentially, those rents are changing quite a bit over time. It becomes really challenging to be able to predict what those values are going to be, kind of moving forward. Okay? Sorry, what? Yeah, the market, changing dramatically, that obviously could change that value dramatically. Okay.
Would you agree that income approach is basically buying a cap rate?
That's one way to look at it, yeah. Because, and this is also why there's so much less emotion in the commercial side of the real estate business than on the residential side. The residential side, as a general rule, it is a very emotion-driven, very passion-driven, very, it's all about how people feel about the property and about how the property looks, all the aesthetics, all of those sorts of things, which on the commercial side, those who don't care. What's the cash flow? I will buy the ugliest property in town if it cash flows, okay? I could care less what it looks like, okay? If it's producing a really rock-solid income stream, what do I care? You follow what I'm saying? But on the residential side, it's a whole different kind of mindset, about those properties. Doesn't make it better, doesn't make it worse, it's just different, okay? And so, on the income side, just kind of a sort of a follow-through with that, there are a lot of property types out there that we don't really ever talk about that can potentially generate a lot of cash flow. Like, one of my former students, some of you may have been in class with him, he was all about trailer parks. Trailer parks, RV parks, that sort of thing. You can make a mountain of money off of those things because all you're doing is leasing out a pad site. You know, your piece of concrete with utility hookups, you know, and you're charging a monthly fee and if somebody doesn't pay, get out of here, you know. It's a pretty simple, sort of basic, sort of model. But yet, how many people want to go to a dinner party and say, yeah, I own a bunch of, you know, trailer parks and talk about, you know, their investment trailer? No one, you know. I mean, you know, they want to talk about this beautiful, you know, shiny office building or, you know, whatever that they own and invest in, you know. I mean, I will buy junk property all day long if it cash flows. You know, some of the property I have owned has been some of the ugliest stuff you will have ever seen, but it cash flows, okay? And that is the point. And so I think, you know, that's the thing that you really have to focus on with the income approach to value. It's all about the cash flow and the stability of that cash flow, okay? All right, can't stress that enough. Okay, moving forward. All right, so let's just start with a simple little example on the sales comparison approach that you may have a property that you're trying to compare to the, let me just sort of make sure I state this. We have comparables and we have the subject property that we are trying to value. So the comparables are the similar properties that have sold in the marketplace. The subject property is the one that we are trying to value right here, right now, that we either own or we're trying to buy or we're trying to finance, whatever it is. And so the normal approach for comparables, depending on the kind of sale it is, you're probably going to have a minimum of 3 properties. And the norm would maybe be 5. Okay, somewhere in that vicinity, usually. Okay, so you can have more. Nothing says you can't have more, but it's all about a data collection. You know, and as it gets easier and easier to get that information, you know, you know, most of it's available electronically. Yeah, you could potentially have an Excel spreadsheet of 100 different properties that are somewhat similar, and then begin to kind of parse out the details and excruciating pain of what those, you know, similarities are and what those differences are. So, but normally it's been, you know, kind of a thing. We get 3 to 5 simply because that if you get 3 to 5 comparables and they all are kind of telling you the same story and are kind of pointing toward the same overall value, you kind of have to think, okay, those are valid. But if you were to get, let's say you start with 3, and you get one that gives you a value way up here, and then another one that gives you a value, you know, down in the basement, and then another one that's somewhere in the middle, you shouldn't feel too comfortable of just averaging those 3 and saying, oh, that middle one is the real true value. You're probably going to want to go out and get a few more sales to just sort of see if they do hover around that middle value, or if the top end was really, because what you could be is the time factor we talked about. It could very well be that the one that you got as a comparable that was at the top of the market, well, then maybe that was when everything was awesome in terms of sale values, but yet 3 months later, the value may have been down to here, and now the current value is the one that's down here, you know, at the basement. So if you're really looking to make sure that you're getting, you know, accuracy, you would want to get more that are going to be recent to give you an accurate valuation. Does that make sense? I mean, not to belabor this, but maybe you read the article, I guess it was yesterday or the day before, it was talking about the high-end condo units down in Miami, specifically the ones that have been selling for like 13 million plus or so. And basically the argument was that all of these multi-million-dollar investors that had, you know, in some cases billionaires that had bought these condo units in Miami. One of the properties, I can't remember the name of it, maybe it starts with F, like Farage or Faraz. Anyway, the point being is, it was saying that all these folks had bought, you know, 2, 3, 4 years ago, and had bought at a price up here, and all of them are beginning to get really worried that the prices are going to fall, and so they're now all selling them at significantly less than what they bought them for, taking a significant cut in Bath in the sense of not getting, you know, what they paid for them, like paying, you know, what they may have paid, let's say 15 million, they're selling it now for 12 or 13 million, you know, and what was interesting in terms of the conclusion of the article, which I would tend to agree with, is, okay, these are smart, sophisticated people. They know the direction the market's going. And so they're immediately saying, hey, things are, you know, starting to take a you know, kind of, we're over the hump. We probably need to cash out now and get out now before the nastiness begins to really take place. So it's kind of an interesting, you know, now you can read all you want into that, but it's just kind of, you know, fascinating to me that is just kind of, is that an early warning signal that things are really about to take a turn?
You think it's a good time to worry now? Or?
I'm sorry?
Can you really worry about the time now?
I would say, if you own something now, we're at the peak.
Yeah.
There's no question, in my mind, there's no question. You know, I do not see values going up, okay, at this point. You know, but the question is how much they're going to fall.
We don't have that artificial kind of thing that we had before with the credit default swaps and all of that.
Yeah, but you know, interest rates are going up. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but my point being is, okay, if I'm wrong, sue me. But you know, the point is that, you know, I really do feel that we are right there at the tippy top, and it's just a question of how far does it go down. It may only go down 10, 20%, but it also, if there's enough chaos, you know, that 10 or 20% could trigger a lot of other things that causes it to fall that much more.
And some of that may come from external
right.
factors like the economy.
It can come from a whole variety of things. Okay, but like I said, we don't want to get too far. We got a lot of stuff we need to get through here.
Well, in the stock market in the last 3 weeks since they raised the interest rate one more time, D.R. Horton, I hate to say this, went down like 25% in 3 weeks. Lennar went down 20, and even Home Depot from 200 down to like 170-ish, 180-ish. So affordability as interest rates go up, go down. And my wife is, everybody's talking about the market going down. Everybody. So it's going to come to fruition.
Are you referring to like residential and commercial, or just?
Yeah, well, I mean, because ultimately, one depends on the other. It's an intertwined relationship. You know, people have to have money to spend on goods and services, and the commercial places and the businesses have to be viable in order for them to succeed. So there's a very good chance that, yes, those can go down as well, depending on how closely they're tied. Okay, I would love to talk more about this, but we've got to get through this other aspects of this material. Okay, all right. So let's just say that we've got a property, a comparable, and give me a dollar amount that it sold for. $250,000. Okay, and so we need to make some adjustments to this property for overall market conditions. And so some examples, and actually I think your book gives several different ones. I'm gonna write up a couple. So let's just say that we're gonna adjust it upward by 2% for the sale date. We're going to adjust it downward by 3% for square footage. I'll explain these. And we're going to adjust it upward by 10% for location. And a negative 8% for front footage, or frontage. Explain that. And then lastly, an adjustment for 3% for the age. Okay, now we picked these particular variables. Once again, the sale date, square footage, location, street frontage, and the age of the property, okay? And in this case, what we're sort of saying is we need to make an adjustment to the sales comparable to make it equivalent to the subject property. Okay, so now in this case, we've kind of given you all of this information. I just kind of want you to go through the math and just kind of think about it a little bit. But what we're in essence saying is that this property, relative to the subject property, we have to make an adjustment. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, just hear me out, because this is where the logic doesn't initially make sense. Okay? I'm going to say that. The logic that I'm about to express initially will not make sense to you until you think it through. Okay? All right. So let's just start with a relatively easy one. Square feet. What we're saying is we need to make a downward adjustment to the comparable property to make it equal to the subject property. Does that make sense?
So the subject property.
So this is where, once again, we make sure we're very clear on this logic of what we're sort of saying, all right? That we're saying that the comparable property has less, this is the best way I think I can explain it, has less square footage than the subject property. Therefore, we have to reduce it by the 3% in order to come up with the value for the subject property. Okay, so if we isolate that one factor, so in other words, what we're basically saying, just to kind of keep things simple, that $250,000 is what the comparable property sold for. Yes? So we're going to adjust it to make it comparable to the subject property. We're basically saying, all right, 97%, we're looking at this one variable, that means 242,500 would be the equivalent value. Okay? Does that make sense? Just on that one single variable. Okay?
Which property is larger? Just to
Okay, so once again, what this is doing is this is making the comparable property equal to the subject property.
In this context, which one's bigger? Square feet.
Once again, what we're saying is this negative 3%, we are adjusting the comparable property downward.
It has nothing to do with the actual square.
Well, we're adjusting it downward to reflect basically its relative size to the subject property. Okay? All right. Now, so what we're going to do, which is very simple, is you're just basically going to take the net change and make that adjustment. Does that make sense?
So add them all.
So you're going to add them all up. So in this case, 2 minus 3 plus 10 minus 8 plus 3 gives us a net of a positive 4%. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay? So, what that means is that our comparable of $250,000 is now going to have to be adjusted upward. By $10,000 to make it equivalent to the subject property for purposes of analysis. So what in essence we're saying is that the subject property is worth $260,000 relative to the comparable property.
You do a 3 minimum, 5 normal, 5 different properties to wash it out.
Right. Okay, does that make
So
sense?
if you did it 5 different properties, then you get the average of those?
Yeah, that's all you really did. I mean, once again, this is not, well, okay, I don't want to say it's not a precise science because it is and it isn't, okay? The math involved is precise. But the dollar amounts or the percentage amounts, there's some wiggle room there depending on what your assumptions are. The general idea, though, is you're trying to come up with some sort of a way of isolating important factors that are going to have an influence on the value of the property. Okay, does that make sense? So whenever you build your valuation model, you know, that's what you're going to try to do. Now, what actually happens in reality in a lot of cases is you just simply try to find as closely comparable properties as you can, and then simply do it on a per square foot basis as a nice rough estimate, and then adjust that number up or down a little bit depending on other random factors. Not random, but other factors that you would potentially take into consideration. Now, I don't want to go down this road because it's going to take way too much time, but I want to just kind of throw it out there. One of the things that you will hear about in appraisal as it relates to isolating out all these factors is to apply something that is called a hedonic pricing model, okay? What that means, if you think about the word hedonic, okay, hedonism, okay? Well, what is hedonism? To give something pleasure, to give something value. Well, the idea is that with real estate properties, what is it that it's providing that is of value, that is of pleasure, that is of some substance to the purchaser? And that's why, especially on the residential side, it's a very easily, very applicable sort of thing, because you're saying, okay, the location gives it value, or the view gives it value, or the lack of crime gives it value. All these things that would potentially make people happy and more satisfied. And so the idea of the hedonic pricing model is it would take into account all of these different sort of factors, and you kind of merge them all together statistically to come up with, okay, here's what the real value is. Okay? All right, moving forward. Okay. Gross income multipliers. All right. With gross income multipliers.
Sorry. Out of the three that you listed, the sales comparison, cost, replacement income, we only need to know the sales comparison?
No, we're not done yet. Trust me. Okay. All right. So gross income multiplier. Let's say that we have a sale price for a property of $1 million. That's what it sold for. Okay. And we have the gross income, potential gross income, of, let's say 200,000. Okay? So our gross income multiplier would be nothing more than taking 1 million divided by 200,000, and it gives us a value of 5, and that would be our gross income multiplier. Now, how does this get used? Okay, from a valuation perspective, and why does it get used? This is probably the roughest of all the measures out there from an income approach to value of property, but you would use it in the case where you have limited information available to you. If all you really have available to you is what the maximum rent that the property could achieve and what the properties have sold for in the market, then this is just simply giving you an indicator that you're basically saying properties out there in the market are selling 5 times of what their earnings are. Okay, so those of you that once again come in as finance majors from undergrad, you know, you've probably heard of like earnings multiples. Okay, well, this is the same sort of thing for real estate. You're just simply saying, in this case, what is the property selling for relative to the earnings that it's generating on a gross basis? Does that make sense? Okay, so you would find, once again, 3, 5, 10 different properties that have sold in the marketplace. You would get an idea of what they were charging in rent and come up with a gross income multiplier, average those together. Hopefully they're relatively close in alignment. If they are relatively close in alignment, then you can feel pretty good that that is a simple, basic, rough way to get at the value for the property. Does that make sense? Yes.
Is the top line figure, gross income, or is that like a revenue?
No, this is the top line on the projected the operating statement.
It's like a revenue.
Yeah, it's your total possible revenue, gross income. No expenses taken out, no other income. This is the most rental revenue that you could make on the property. Okay. If it were fully occupied.
And you had no expenses.
And you have no expenses. That's what I'm saying. It's a rough estimate of the value. Okay. Because this requires you to have almost no market information whatsoever, other than what did it sell for, what can it supposedly rent for in terms of the rental rate per square foot.
On your own assumptions,
right.
And it's rough.
Right.
Understood.
Okay, moving forward. Any questions? Okay. What? Okay. Cap rate and direct capitalization. This is another one that would be classified in the gift category, okay? All right. All right, so the cap rate and what's called direct capitalization. All right, so in this case, let's say that we've got a property that has an annual net operating income equal to what? 300,000. Okay, and we have established that the cap rate on this is, let's say, 7%. All right, then what we're asking for is, what is the value of the property? Okay, once again, we go back to our good friend Irv. Okay, the income number would be 300,000. Cap rate would be the 7%. Solve for value. So the value is going to be 4,285,714. Let's say 29. Did I get one wrong? 300.
That's right.
Divided by 0.07. Yeah, that's right. Oh, I heard a bunch of grumbling back there. That's why I was just like, what did I put that wrong? Okay, all right, so let's talk about this real quickly. All right, so this, obviously, once again, should not be anything new, but here, and this gets to your point, now we're using an operating income, which does take into account vacancies and collection losses, other income, operating expenses, and so forth. But the problem is, with this one, that requires us to have that information. Whereas the gross income multiplier, you don't have to have any of that, or you may not be able to get that information. Okay, that's why I'm saying this is a much rougher estimation of value than would be the cap rate, because it does take into account all those other things. Now, the cap rate itself of the 7%, you know, where does that come from? Well, we, I think, talked a little bit about this previously. The cap rate is, what is that rate of return that has to be offered in order to attract capital to it? In other words, to attract investors to it. And so what we're saying is that here, 7% is that rate that investors are willing to invest in this kind of product, whatever it is. Okay, does that make sense? Yes, no, warm fuzzy feelings. Okay, moving on. All right.
Is that a levered cash flow, that 300 cash? Is that like?
No, because the debt service comes out after your net operating income. Okay. So, in this case, discounted present value techniques, I'm calling them, or forecasting NOI. All right, so in this case, let's say that we start off here in year one, our NOI is what? $1 million amount. 50,000. Okay, so 50,000 is going to be our initial net operating income. All right, and each year thereafter, we're trying to forecast what that NOI is going to be, much like we tried to forecast what rent is going to be based on the CPI and that sort of thing. So the same exact approach here, instead of dealing with the rental dollars per square foot per year, we're just dealing with the NOI. So if I basically say, okay, you've got a growth rate of NOI applied to year 2 of, let's say, 2%, and year 3 a growth rate of 4%, then what is going to be the NOI for each of those years? So you're simply going to take, in this case, 1.02 and 1.04 multiplied by, in this case, the 50,000. And so you're going to get 51,000 here for the year 2 NOI, and then you're going to take that 51,000, multiply it by the 1.04, and you would get 53,040. Okay, in terms of forecasting NOI. Now, the idea behind this, and you're going to see much more of this afternoon for those of you that are in the financial modeling class, is to make all these assumptions about how much we can grow income and expenses, and then how that's going to translate into our overall cash flows and rates of return and that sort of thing. But all we're really doing here is we're just simply making sure that you understand that, yeah, if we apply these growth rates, this is what's going to happen in terms of our income growth. Okay? Make sense? Okay. Very straightforward. All right.
And when you pull the 2% and 4%, you just...
I'm going to give it to you. It's part of the Christmas gift. Okay. All right, moving on. Okay, going in versus terminal cap rates. Okay, the going in cap rate is whenever you buy the property. The terminal cap rate is when you sell the property. Okay? So let's just do a very simple example. But let's say your NOI is $10,000 a year going in, all right? And your cap rate is, let's say, 10%. That means that the value on the property is $100,000. Okay, everybody good with that? Okay, now we have bought the property, we have owned the property for, let's say, it doesn't really matter, but let's just say 5 years, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so 5 years later, we decide to sell the property, and let's just say that it has the same net operating income. But now the question is, would we prefer our terminal cap rate, if we're going to be selling the property, to be higher or lower than the going in cap rate? Why?
To make the value higher.
To make the value higher. Yes.
5%.
I think almost in unison I heard. Okay. So that's good. That's a good sign. All right. So in this case, let's say it was 7%. Okay. So 10,000 divided by 7% would mean the value would be 142,857. So what we're saying has really occurred over that holding period is the income hasn't changed on the property, but what has changed, maybe one of a couple of different things. One is the risk profile of the property has changed to where it is now perceived by the market as being less risky, and or you could have a decline in interest rates that has maybe occurred over the holding period. Or, you know,
Or demand could go up for that type of property.
I'm sorry?
Demand could go up.
Or just the overall demand for this particular property has gone up, therefore, you know, driving prices up, but driving the cap rate down. Okay, everybody good with that? Yep. Okay, perfect, wonderful. so land values, highest and best use. All right, so let's say that we've got a particular property, and in this case, let's just make the assumption that it is income producing land, okay? Could be we're growing crops on it, could be even a long-term ground lease, but it is land. It's not the building per se, it's just the land, all right? And so let's just say on an annual basis, this property is going to generate how much net operating income? Okay, $1 million. All right, and that is our annual, I'm sorry?
That's a lot of crops.
It's a lot of crops, okay, a lot of land. Sounds like a big government lease out in the west somewhere to get oil off of or something. Oil lease. Okay, which actually is quite common, especially in Texas. And strangely enough, the big beneficiary for that are universities. They have a permanent university fund that was basically that they decided that it made sense, smartly many years ago, to say, okay, we're going to take all this land that's out in the middle of nowhere that's basically, seemingly at the time, was worthless, and then all of a sudden they discovered oil, but they basically put it to where all the revenue off of it goes to the permanent university fund to fund Texas universities, which is an interesting thing, but it's all about the oil that they're able to extract from it, and then those long-term ground leases. Anyway, so the annual NOI that is being generated from the land is $1 million. And it's expected that the investors are wanting a cap rate or rate of return of, let's say, 12%. Okay. But we've got another little intervening factor, and that is that whoever was leasing this land out also put in a little growth rate, okay? And says that the growth rate, the NOI growth rate is going to be, let's say, 2%, okay? And what we're asking you to do is to basically calculate the value of this land. Okay, somebody said 10 million? Yeah. Okay, what are we doing to get that? You're basically using the ERB model. But you're adding one little feature to it. You're doing the cap rate or the rate of return minus the growth rate. Okay, those of you that once again are finance majors, what was this model called?
Gordon Growth.
Gordon Growth Model. Woohoo! All right, yay. Not that matters, because it doesn't.
No, it does.
That's what it's
I know
called.
who it matters.
All right. So, in this case, all you're doing, and mathematically it works out, but conceptually you look at it and you're like, it doesn't quite make sense to me, but trust me. You can run off on an Excel model and see exactly how it all works out. So what you really have happening here is that 12% minus the growth rate of 2% gets translated into 10%, which then would mean $10 million as the overall value for the property, okay, with that sort of growth rate. So anytime that you have an income stream that's going to, this is like a perpetuity, that if it lasts more than 50 plus odd years, you can pretty much apply this sort of a model very easily because as you sort of exceed 50 years, other sort of in other words, your revenue streams become worth less and less and less that far after the future where they're almost negligible. So it becomes very easy to use this. So the simple answer, $10 million. Okay? All right, moving forward. Okay. We're going to leave the mortgage equity capitalization for last. It's going to be the most complicated. All right. So valuation of lease fee estate. All right. So in this case, let's say that we've got some market value leases, and what's the lease rate we're going to use? The current market value lease rate. What?
20 foot.
Okay. $20 per square foot per year is the market value lease rate. All right, and in this case, let's say that they're leased at something less than this currently. In other words, the original lease rate was $14 per square foot per year was the original or current lease amount. Does that make sense, everybody? In other words, you leased it out at the $14 a square foot, but the actual current market value of the lease is at $20 a square foot. All right. And this, and the question would be, how much value is being lost on this property? And in this case, let's say the lease term is for 10 more years. And our discount rate is, let's say, 5%. And while it really doesn't matter, we'll go ahead and say the property is 10,000 square feet. Okay.
Any step ups?
No. Okay, so in this case, what we're going to do is as follows. We're going to, first of all, just simply, we can multiply it out. We can either do it on a per square foot basis, or we can do it on a total dollar basis. It really doesn't matter. That's why I'm saying that the per square foot, or the amount of square footage really doesn't matter, because ultimately it's going to come out and we'll express it either way. All right, so you're going to take the 20 minus the 14, and you get $6 per square foot per year. Okay? And
that's the loss.
That is the loss. What we're asking for is what is the present value of that loss. And if we want to do it, we want to continue, we could also say, all right, if we want to do it on the overall value, 10,000 square feet times the $6 loss, that would equate to $60,000 basically a year loss. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? In other words, what we're currently leasing it out for versus what the current market rate is. That's how much we're losing. So in other words, we could potentially pay our tenant 60 grand to just leave the space, if we could release the space immediately, you know, and, well, yeah, we break even in that year and then hopefully get the remainder, you know, thereafter. But that's probably not going to happen because they've got to find space, which is probably going to be at the current market rate as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is pretty much say, all right, one payment per year, put in the 60,000 as a payment, and this is occurring over 10 years, and the discount rate we're using is 5%. So what is the present value of that leasehold interest? Okay, so what we're saying from the property owner's perspective is we're losing out on the equivalent of $463,000 of income over the next 5 years because our lease, I'm sorry, 10 years, yeah, 10 years, because our lease is below market. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay, so, I mean, yes, in a perfect world, we would love to be able to ask our current tenants to leave, repopulate the space at current market rent, or hopefully have a clause in our lease that would say it would adjust to current market rent. But the reason for doing this calculation is this kind of begins to show you, oh, this is what can happen to me if I lock in a lease at a set rate for the entire lease term and the market all of a sudden swings in the other direction. Okay?
As a tenant or a land.
Right. So, I mean, another way of looking at it is that the tenant can basically also look at it from their perspective and saying, woohoo, we're saving, you know, we're paying below market rent for the next, 10 years. All of our competitors, maybe, or new competitors anyway, that maybe just renewed their lease in the current market conditions, have a much higher cost than what we do. So maybe we're able now to maybe charge lower prices for our goods and services than they do, and maybe do that much better. Okay, all right, moving on. Okay, cost approach. Now, one of the things to point out about the cost approach, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is there are typically 3 different sort of adjustments that you are going to do for obsolescence. Okay, I'm going to see if I can spell it. Obsolescence. I think that's right. Anyway, you get the general idea. You can hear what I'm saying. Obsolescence. L-E-C, sorry, L-E-S-C.
Stick to the number.
There we go. Yep, obsolescence, okay. So all 3 of those are examples of types of obsolescence that can occur that you need to adjust for with the cost approach. So physical obsolescence would mean you are going to basically say, okay, this property is 10 years old, and maybe has an expected lifespan of 30 years old. So with no renovations of substance that have occurred over that 10 years, then you're saying you're going to depreciate its value by roughly 30%. Because if it's 10 years into a 30-year lifespan, then you're saying it's depreciated, 1/3 of its value. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. Functional obsolescence is going to deal with how the property is laid out and how it's potentially used. And so a lot of the functional pieces are going to be, to a certain extent, maybe design related, but also, how things have evolved and maybe changed over time, that features that a commercial or a residential property had in place at one period of time that they needed maybe space for, that they no longer need space for, could be of concern. It could all, like a good example would be, the amount of space needed in really old buildings for boilers and for, a lot of the sort of mechanical systems and things like that. They don't, those machines have become much more efficient over time, smaller, and then the placement of them can be probably much different than what it was at one point in time. But, as you mentioned, even like, the other sort of systems of telephone systems and, switchboards to, basically having all these other features that are just no longer needed. That is an example of functional obsolescence, and then so because it's no longer needed, the question is, well, do you take it out? How do you adjust for it in terms of the value? Okay, does that make sense? Because obviously, if it's functionally obsolete, you're going to be subtracting value off of the existing property relative to what current conditions are. And then the last one, in terms of external or economic obsolescence, this is more of a locational thing, okay? This is where the property, maybe at one point in time, was in the hot zone of activity, and then over the years, that neighborhood or that particular city or that particular region, maybe because of employment losses or just economic transitions that have occurred there, now as a result of that, it's located in an area that just no longer has an economic base able to support it, so therefore it's we're going to sort of say it's economically or externally sort of obsolete because it no longer really serves the same function that it once did. Okay, make sense? Okay.
Well, like the apartment we went to where those former students, that's kind of
Yep.
has the opposite, like with the brewery going in there and kind of the.
Yeah, now, maybe at one point in time was maybe an okay area of town that probably went through a substantial decline, and then now is back up again. Okay? All right. Okay. Mortgage equity capitalization. All right. Can we do it? Yes, we can. Okay, this one is sort of a gift, but it's not sort of a gift, and you'll understand why once you see the test. Okay. All right, mortgage equity capitalization. All right. So the general theory here is that when we're trying to value a property, that if you take and you isolate the value of the mortgage on the property along with the value of the equity in the property, and you add those two together, that gives you the mortgage equity capitalization or overall value estimate. Okay, conceptually, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, in other words, it's sort of like saying debt plus equity equals value. Okay, at its fundamental core. But how do you get there? Okay, well, you're going to be given, a handful of things to sort of start out with this. So just to kind of work our way through, and so let's say that we've got a net operating income of $50,000, and we've got a debt coverage ratio of 1.2. Okay, so this is going to be the first piece of information we're going to start out with. And by the way, this whole example is in the book. Okay, in case you want to refer to it. All right. So 50,000, and with a debt coverage ratio of 1.2, that means that our annual debt service, or maximum annual debt service, is going to be what?
41.
Yep. So you're going to take 50,000 divided by 1.2, okay? And that is going to give us our annual debt service of 41,600, let's say 66, 67, okay? Everybody good? All right. Then, if we've got that, let's assume that we've got a loan for 20 years. Okay. It's a loan, 20 years, interest rate of, what do we use here? 11%. Okay, let's see what we get. Okay, now we're going to assume that this is going to be with monthly payments. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is take the annual debt service, divide it by 12. which is gonna give us monthly payments of $34.72.22. Okay, you right with me still? Okay, so we're gonna put that in, again, assuming 12 payments per year, as our payment amount for 20 years or 240 months at 11% interest rate, and then solve for present value. And you get $336,394 and basically 2 cents. That is the mortgage value piece. Okay, so you're halfway done. Okay, so right with me on what we did there. So that's the debt side. Okay, so now what we have to do is calculate the value of the equity side. Okay, are we good? All right, so for the equity side, what we need to know are the cash flows that the property is going to have over the next 5 years. So basically, cash flows are going to be 8,333, 9833, 11,378, 12,969, and 14,608 are our before tax cash flows on the equity side. Okay? Now, hold on just a second. Okay, so this is just simply saying these are going to be our cash flows, if you will, on the equity side, because this is our before tax cash flow from the property and what it's generated. Okay? Now, along with that, the property is going to sell. So a sale at end of year 5 is going to sell at, and this would be given to you, $526,945, and then you would subtract out the mortgage balance, which you could calculate from the information previously, and that's going to be a mortgage balance of $305,495, which means your total sort of net would be $221,450. Okay? Now, what you're going to do, if that's your net after you've sold the property, you've paid off your mortgage balance, then that is your net cash flow at the end of year 5, or your reversion. Okay? So you would add that, 221,450. Okay? All right? And so basically what you're going to do, there's going to be one payment per year. 0 is initial cash flow, and then all the subsequent cash flows. Whatever that is your final cash flow. Then you're going to apply whatever the discount rate is on this property, which let's assume is 12%. It's going to be the rate of return we're going to give our investors. And then we're going to solve for net present value. Okay? And so whatever number that we get there, this is going to be the equity side. That's going to be added to the debt side, or our mortgage, and that is going to give us our value. Okay? So our mortgage, we've already calculated, that was $336,394.02. So now all we got to do is punch in this other little piece down here, So 221, 450 plus 14,608, 236,058. All right, when we go through and we do the actual calculation, you'll trust me on this, you're gonna get 165,566. You're gonna add those two together, and the overall value of this property is gonna be 501,960.02. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, and you can also find this exact problem in your book on page 318. It's obviously in chapter 10. Okay? All right, we need to take the quiz. Okay.
Can you just go through that one more?
Can you bring the screen down just one second, quick, went so fast, I missed something up there. 3, 4.
That second part.
No, even that. It's how do we study for the last quiz? For the test.
Max.
This is there, is there 3 tests for?
Yep.
3 quizzes?
2 quizzes today.
Oh, 2 quizzes today. Okay, that makes sense. So that makes sense. Now that makes sense. Oh, makes sense.
If you need to take a quick break, now's the time to do it. A little bathroom break, whatever. Sorry? Well, yeah, I mean, just a quick little break. As soon as I finish handing these out, then I'll handle the quiz. Okay. Ms. Garcia.
No, I know you should, but there was never, it wasn't in my notes, so I never saw it.
Marcelo, you're good. Right here.
Oh, like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I have a question for you. Where you at? It's Osher.
Wait,
There's evidence.
the test, yeah. What about? We got the test back also, or?
No, we just got the same grades. Oh, yeah. No. Got him.
Is this bullshit here?
I don't know what the grades were like. What was the top grade on the test? Do you remember offhand?
It was an 8 test.
I know this one's an 8. Yeah, I remember that.
Adriana, is she here?
I guess we could 10 to 9.
Right.
All in the camera stretch.
Wow. Adriana,
I gotta give myself some Red Bull.
I know.
hey, where's Mo? Is Mo back over here? Where's he? He's right here. Oh, put that on Mo's. Andre, where's he?
Did you give out the test as well, or you gave it out last week?
I gave it last week. Talk about it. Well, I mean,
Can I just come check it out?
yeah. Okay, all right, shh. Who has not taken quiz 4, therefore needs a blank sheet? Okay. Everybody else got their quiz sheet back? Yes? Okay. Anybody else with the quiz sheet before we get, or the answer sheet before we pass the quiz sheet? Okay. Any red ball there?
No. I got recollection.
Oh my God. Lack of coffee. Okay, here we go. Bada bing, bada boom.
So quiz 5 would be 9?
I'm sorry?
Quiz 5 will be 9?
That is correct.
Okay.
Was that a question?
Well, the quiz is 9 and 6 is 10. Chapter.
Oh.
Yeah, notes.
You don't want to test it.
So this is all in chapter 9. What do you?
No, it's 9 and 10. It's over 10 that last part. Look at those percentages.
Chapter 9, we need one more.
Okay.
Chapter 9, you said it's quiz 5, right?
That's what we're
Percentage correct.
Yeah.
But